Good evening, YouTube. Welcome back. And yeah, I'm very excited to be here today with Lucian Vâlsan, um, controversial figure.
All
Actually,
those all those years and you still haven't managed to correctly pronounce my name.
no, please enlighten us. Go ahead.
No worry, don't worry. Right. So
Vâlsan, you said it? Vâlsan?
Vlsan with U,
Vâlsan. Okay, well,
yeah,
there you go.
like
Yeah, well,
wyborz in Polish,
sorry?
like wyborz in Polish, which is choice.
Okay, so Vâlsan. Yeah, well, people butcher my name too. So the reason I say he's controversial is not because he's actually controversial, it's because he talks common sense, which itself is these days controversial.
To be fair,
So
it hasn't been common in so many decades. So,
exactly, we'd like to bring it back. And he's agreed with me to talk about the subject of South African apartheid. And we may overlap somewhat with Israel as well, because the term apartheid these days is really used to justify Islamic jihad, an Islamic terror campaign against Israel and against Jews in particular and the Israeli state. And the term is being misused, and the term has been even misunderstood when apartheid was in effect. There are different perspectives, and of course, we've only had the communist ANC perspective. And I am definitely not going to be kind to the ANC. We want to question some of the long-standing history. We want to bring up some uncomfortable facts. We want to look at the opposite side because there were some very good aspects to apartheid policies. There were reasons behind many of the policies. Now, certainly, you can point to some questionable things, but there were a lot of positives that were forgotten, that were overlooked, and people cheered on communism because the ANC is a communist organization. So, Lucian, over to you. How have you been? What have you been up to?
oh well, I've been up to the clown show that is the Romanian presidential election. Last night, I videotaped a 90-minute long history about the allegedly unknown quote unquote far right candidate who is neither far right nor unknown. He's been in public life for 34 years. So I just videotaped a long video inquiry, I guess, investigation going back to newspapers from 1991 with this guy stealing the stamp from the Environmentalist Party. He's been in cahoots with the globalists and the far left for 34 years, but now suddenly everyone just likes to pretend that he's the far right candidate. So that's the thing that I've been up to in the last week. More generally, I know I'm getting ready for another trip to Central Asia. I'm getting ready for a trip to Poland. So things like that. Um, the usual things. I just intervene wherever people would hope that I won't intervene.
Making yourself useful, yeah.
Yeah.
Far right these days just mean that you don't want foreigners to rape your daughter.
Mm, roughly speaking, yes. Uh, with a
Uh,
few twists and variations depending on the country and the current political context. But yes, roughly speaking, that's basically what far right can mean these days. That's how you can have a communist far right, like in Germany, the BSW. It's effectively a Leninist party, but just happens to believe in borders and can we not have our daughters raped by illegal migrants? Uh, but other than that, it's a very Leninist party. It's broken off from Die Linke, the party that ruled over the DDR during the times of the Soviet Union, the East Germany, that is DDR. So being far right these days is really easy. Just have the centrist position of the year 2001, and there you go, you're far right.
yeah, no, that's another abused term. Welcome, Villainous, and welcome everyone. Please share, subscribe. Also, look out for my friend's link in the description. Check out his channel for his fantastic commentary. And as I said, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. Let's all jump into this one. Villainous says, how in Romania can you have an election, but the guy who gets the vote isn't allowed to take office?
Yeah,
I
I'm
feel like,
currently writing the video on that. It will be on my channel in 2 weeks or so. Basically, the second round hasn't been held, so technically there is no winner of the presidential election. The whole process will be restarted from scratch. The first round again will be on May the 4th. So that's the thing. How that happened, yeah, I'll explain it in a few days,
okay,
weeks.
that'll be interesting. Yeah. I mean, East European politics is something that people don't really understand. I mean, West European politics is a mess, but
The thing is that we understand West European politics better because these days everyone has been living in Eastern Europe. They just don't know it yet. If you look at West European politics through Eastern European rules and norms, all of it makes perfect sense. But if you try to apply 19th century West European rules, yeah, of course, none of it makes sense. But then again, that's because you're all been living in Eastern Europe for years now, but you just don't know it yet.
Okay, that'll be interesting to know more about. I mean, hopefully one day in the future we can have when you're free again, we can have another chat about politics.
Oh, there is on my channel a 5 hour long podcast that is called "You're All Living in Eastern Europe," and it's the current news from like 4 years ago, which all of it synthetically prove that the whole planet is living in Eastern Europe. They just don't know it yet.
Okay, you know what? On that point, though, on a very serious note, here in Poland, communism fell back in '89. The communists were here for a few years extra, then they left. Nobody was charged. Nobody ever went to prison for the disappearances, the tortures, and so on. Similar situation in South Africa. Similar situation in a lot of places where the communists were guilty of crimes against humanity, got away scot-free, and now they're the government. Same in Eastern Germany. Now the old commies are the government, and they just run. It's just basically old commies in new suits. I mean, isn't that something that we're dealing with right now?
Yeah, pretty much. It also doesn't help that when you change the regime, and this has happened in South Africa as well, when you change the regime, yeah, sure, you can jail some of the leadership, maybe. We did that, for instance, in Romania, but only a few of them, not the biggest ones, well, with the exception of the Ceausescus, who became good communists. But generally speaking, when you change the regime, you still need a lot of the apparatchiks of the old regime. Germany has been through this twice. I mean, denazification was mostly for show because a lot of the old officialdom from the Third Reich still ended up being public dignitaries and what do you call them, civil servants until they retired legally into the new Bundesrepublik. Because at the end of the day, there are only so many people that are interested in politics in a country. And of those, half of them are incompetent. And of the competent half, well, a lot of them will have been involved in the previous regime as well. So you kind of have to keep them around, and you have to recycle them. It's called the rotation of the cadre, which is again a Leninist term, but it applies everywhere.
Yeah, and the term cadre is one that's used by the ANC, and the term comrade. And
Of
welcome
course.
to that. Yeah, of course. I mean, people don't realize just how much socialism has actually made inroads into Western politics, into Western culture, society, and yeah, let's talk about some of that today. So, I've got a few things I want to raise that are going to be, well, hopefully to start the conversation. Now, I've not necessarily examined and exhaustively historically researched and fact checked every single one of these things, but it gives us a talking point. It gives us something to discuss. It gives us a perspective that there's another side to this conversation. And of course, as we all know, fact checkers have basically been propagandists and liars for the last several decades. So why should I have to bust the chop trying to be 100% accurate when these guys were just lying to you to your face? All right, so let's start here. So this is a chart common on the internet, common for South African discourse on what happened. Now, the Afrikaners arrived in South Africa in 1652. Technically, that's the Dutch. Also, the Portuguese came long before that. The Portuguese had a trading station in South Africa long before that, right? More than a century before that, if I recall, in the late 1400s. So what you have is you had the ancestors of the Afrikaners. Now, South Africa obviously had the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, Germans, and French, right? As well as, and then the British eventually dominated, and eventually they left. And we have the Afrikaners, who are the descendants of the Dutch. And my surname is actually an Afrikaner surname. De Jong is Dutch. So I've got German family on my mother's side. I've got English and Dutch family on my father's side, as well as an Indonesian link, oddly enough. So, right, Zulus, it says that the Zulus arrived in 1709. That is not true. So just a couple of pointers here. The Zulu nation, right? Just so you know, the Zulu nation was formed under the leadership of Shaka Zulu in the early 19th century. So that's the 1800s, right? The Zulu nation dates to about 1817. So Shaka through military conquest. He basically killed off the men, kept the kids, raped the wives, and made kids. And he unified all of these tribes that they conquered. What they did was they simply absorbed them into a single clan or group that became the Zulu Kingdom, right? And he was very aggressive. In fact, the man was a psychopath, right? There's nothing amazing or wonderful about him. I mean, if you ask yourself, what did he do in terms of education, schools, technology, science, medicine? The answer is F all, right? These are basically
small-scale Genghis Khan, but in modernity.
Pretty much.
I mean, am I wrong?
No, and I mean, there's so many things I could discuss. For instance, if you look at the black tribes that we're all supposed to, I'm saying this as a black person, but don't forget that few people realize just how racist black people are, and we're not supposed to talk about this. Now, I talk about contentious issues. We're not supposed to talk about politics and religion on this in polite conversation, but that's what I do on this channel. People are constantly going on about how racist white people are. White people are the least racist people on the planet.
At this point, yes.
So again?
At this point, yes.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, at this point, definitely. I mean, so, darn it, don't tell me it's done this to me again. Let me just refresh this and see. There we go. This is something I've covered before. I'm just going to try and do this again. Right. This is a map of the world's most and least racially tolerant countries. If you want to find racism, try India. India is extremely racist. They don't like their neighbors. All right. If you want to look at racially tolerant countries, Australia, New Zealand, and North America, oddly enough, and Scandinavia.
And
right?
Brazil.
Say again, please.
And Brazil as well, according to your map.
And Brazil, yes, true. But if you want to find racism, now South Africa is fairly racially tolerant, and I'm sure that actually applies to white people. When you talk about black people, you're not tribal black people. Don't consider me to be black. That's my impression. That's what I've come to learn, because they consider me a half-breed. I'm a bastard. So, therefore, I'm supposed to be an offspring of the hated white man. And when I say that, there might be some black people that have no problem with white people, but as a culture, they do in general. This is a common thing. I've said this many times, discussed it many times, and people can take that as they want, right? Let's have a look at this, how racial groups rate each other, right? So this is how whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians view each other. So whites, if you look at this, whites have a pretty much even, balanced view of all other races. They're very tolerant towards other groups. Hispanics, right, do not like white people for the most part, right?
Yeah, I have to question that one. I've seen that graph before, and there are quite a few problems with it. You see, this is why I generally try to avoid discussions about race, because they inadvertently end up attempting to generalize a very terminally online US bubble onto the whole planet. And I do have a problem with that, because that bubble is basically wrong. For instance, in the US, Hispanic is now a term that means whatever you want it to mean. So you have blue-eyed blonde people who are Hispanic. You have, I mean, at the end of the day, do the people of Macau, do they count as Latinos? Well, technically, yes, because they speak Portuguese. Mozambicans count as Latinos as well. And I suppose I count as Latino as well. My mother tongue is Latin-based, right? So I do have a problem with the name, with the American categorizations in particular. Same thing with the word white. I mean, white, according to the Census Bureau, is people descendant of the indigenous peoples of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, which by 19th century standards, that would have been a good definition, or even by 17th century standards. By 21st century standards, I'm not sure that is a good definition. Back in the days when North Africa was basically Southern Europe, then yeah, sure. But now that is not the case. So, you know, each of those categorizations have a problem. So the white can mean someone from Lebanon or from southern Jordan, or even from Saudi Arabia. Hispanic can mean
Well,
anyone from Guyana or from Mozambique. And
okay.
then black can mean a lot of things. I mean, Elon Musk is an African American, technically
Yeah, black
speaking.
means not white, but technically is white because people are judging on the color of your skin, not the content of your character.
Yes. And then you have Asian, which, what does Asian mean? I mean, Asian is also Pakistani, is also Indian, it's also Japanese, is also South Korean.
These definitions have been deliberately, shall we say, diluted so that you lose detail, so that you lose specifics, that there's no distinctions. They're trying to erase distinction. But I think generally we know what we're talking about. And you'll notice that...
No, I disagree. I don't think we generally know what we're talking about, because these categorizations, maybe they do make sense in Atlanta, I suppose, but I don't think they make sense in Israel or in South Africa or in Eastern
if you
Europe.
go to South Africa, or you go to many African countries, and let's say I show up there, dressed the way that I am and walking and talking the way that I do, they're going to call me a white boy.
Well, technically speaking, by apartheid terms, you're colored.
Granted, but the thing is, by those black standards, I'm white because...
Oh, yeah, fair enough, yeah.
Right? They're going to look at me as a white kid. They're going to say, hey,
oh, yeah, sure.
Right?
That is not under dispute, at least in my opinion.
Right? But, I mean, under apartheid definitions, I'm colored. Of course, that's a slur in America, but that's a whole... I mean, yeah, so, anywho, but let's just say white people are very tolerant, black people not so much.
Not so much.
How many Jews are there in Morocco? Work that out.
In Morocco, it's still pretty okay, but try Libya, and then it gets a little bit more complicated. Or Afghanistan. In Morocco, it's still pretty okay to be a Jew. It's one of the few in the MENA
but it's not exactly overflowing. So let me see. Wow, this is great. Neutron Star Academy. I've silenced so many Muslims already thanks to your channel. I'm from Sweden, and we're scared here to confront Muslims. I think we're going to start seeing changes. And I think
welcome här, Neutron.
Right. Okay, so the causa. Now, just to provide a bit of a story and context here, why this is important. White people were in Africa and South Africa for the last 500 years. They settled the place, they stayed there, they developed it, they made something of the land. Now, if you go back 100 years and look at the dominant black culture, you've got the Nguni culture that moved down from Tanzania, from Congo, from places like that, and they moved south and they entered into the country a couple of hundred years ago. Some of them maybe a little earlier, but they themselves are colonizers, invaders. They nearly wiped out, they nearly literally genocided the people that I am descended from. Those are the Hottentots Hollanders, those are the Strunkloper, those are the brown peoples of South Africa that were the original settlers in the country. The original people are a brown-skinned people that lived there. These blacks nearly genocided them. It's not a common topic. It's not one that is commonly spoken about. It's not one people want to deal with. The fact that these blacks, these Nguni, also, think, if you go back 100 years, ask yourself, okay, so those blacks, how developed were they? Well, sadly, they weren't. They were roughly as developed as your average cave dweller, right? Is that harsh? Maybe. Is it true? Certainly, right? Maybe some of them had reached the Bronze Age, let's say. They had metal weapons like spears, but did they invent, telescopes? No. Did they make boats, navigation? Did they have compasses? Did they have writing paper? Did they have a writing method? No. Did they have any kind? Did they have socks, shoes, manufacturing? No, right? These were very primitive people. Also, they had no property rights. They had no concept of law and property rights the way we do with a written legal system. They didn't own anything. They were migrants. They were moving around. Wherever they took a dump, that's their home, to paraphrase from Paul Young.
Well, that means they were the perfect poster children for the World Economic Forum. They owned nothing and they were happy.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. And Vlsan says, I think Lucian is just trying to point out that the US has an unrealistic. Agreed. I think it's a fair point. Yeah, these guys were using bows and arrows. They were using 2 rocks to light a fire or a stick to light fires. They had no concept of law. They had no. If you say, okay, fine, where did your dad live? Which patch of ground? What street? What address? Where did you deliver the mail? They couldn't answer that. So when they say we own this land, they owned nothing. Nothing. They can't show you anything, no document. The concept of land ownership is a Western white concept. As we know it today, it's based on property rights and so on. So the land was developed. How much development did these black cultures do of the land? Roughly zero. On a scale from 1 to 10, zero. So what are your thoughts so far, Lucian?
Yeah, it's a very similar discussion to that was fashionable about 5 years ago with the 1619 project, or what was it called, by the former newspaper, the Pravda on Hudson, who basically tried to do some historical revisionism on US's history. And it was basically the same discussion. Look, even if we grant 100% of the premise of the 1619 project, that ultimately there was no Native American nation. There were multiple warring tribes that were warring with each other with no concept of property rights. Yeah, they were slightly more advanced than the pre-Zulu nations, but not by much. And they still didn't have the concept of property rights or the concept of nationhood. I mean, at the very least, the Zulus did found a nation eventually, sure, by Genghis Khan methods, but still they did found a nation. Whereas that was not the case with the Native American tribes. It's basically the same discussion here. We're trying to project, to use your language, white concepts onto peoples and histories that are simply not fit for this context. And as a result, I mean, if we're into anti-imperialism and a decolonization and whatever, can we decolonize the Zulus' history and stop applying concepts that simply do not apply to them?
Yeah,
and that would be the first question. And the second question is, and this is a question that I usually piss off everyone when I ask it, which is, who the hell cares? I mean, there is such thing as there has been enough time has passed that it's inconsequential to present day. This is at some point it becomes a Spurg topic. And if there's one thing that is my resolution for 2025 is common sense Spurg control regulation. At some point, we need to stop the Spurging. Who the hell cares? There's nobody alive from those times. Even their grandchildren, no, great-grandchildren, I think are dead. So at some point, we have to move closer to present day. I mean, the fact that Nelson Mandela was a Moscow-trained communist terrorist still has implications today. Whereas who settled what in the 17th century, not so much anymore. Especially in a place like South Africa, which has seen demographic changes so many times that it rendered the whole discussion not necessarily irrelevant, but definitely moot for the average person and for the general public.
Right. No, thanks. So, guys, what I'm going to recommend is I'll drop the link for this. This is from AfriForum, and you need to log in, make an account, it's free, and watch the documentary called Tainted Heroes. Take a couple of hours, break it up into chunks. You need to watch this documentary to learn the truth about the ANC, about the African National Congress. So now, the South African government was a Christian government. It was a conservative government. It was also abandoned by its European ancestors. They weren't allowed to return to Europe, so they had to make a go of things. They were persecuted by the British. They were literally put into internment camps, and they died. They were allowed to starve to death. They froze to death. They died from disease. They were treated like cattle by the Brits. And in fact, as far as we know, modern internment camps were used for these Afrikaners, these Boers. Boer is a term that means farmer, even though it's used often as a slur. Being a South African farmer is the most dangerous occupation in the world today. Now, I'll just throw
in competition with President of the United States, but yes.
Right. Now, a couple of things, though. I'll throw some various things out, some things as we go. But people demonize South Africa. They demonize the apartheid system. They demonize the white South African government that was in power from 1948. Now, the ANC murdered more people between 1985 and 1994. In those 9 years, the ANC murdered thousands, tens of thousands of people more than the apartheid government would have killed in its entire 50 plus year history from 1948 to 1990. Because, or the 1990s, the ANC was a violent communist revolutionary organization. The top six, the echelon of the ANC, were all communists, were all either very much supportive of communist policies, were all influenced by the Soviets, were trained, supplied, and funded by the Soviets. So let's have a quick look through this. So in no particular order, we'll be going through various things about the ANC. But Oliver Tambo, he was trained in Moscow. Now, I can tell you he didn't go there to be trained as a Boy Scout. He got indoctrinated into communist theory. This would be Leninism, Marxism, so Leninist Marxism. It's certain that the communists obviously had their voice in his head. They had their mouths against his ears so that they would follow communist doctrine. When they opened up training camps for black youth to go to be trained, they were indoctrinating these black youth in communist ideology, right? Nelson Mandela, right? Nelson Mandela was, by any definition, a terrorist, by any definition, a criminal, by any definition, a murderer, even a mass murderer, right? Now, he had military training in Ethiopia, which had Soviet support. Now, I met someone that actually had been part of MK, that had been part of one of the terrorists trained by Mkhonto Wesizwe, the Spear of the Nation. I can't remember his name offhand. I met him. My wife and I actually met him. We spent time speaking with him. He was trained here in Poland, right, in the Warsaw Pact, as part of the training for how to be a good terrorist and a bomb maker. And he met Nelson Mandela here in Warsaw, he told us. Now, Nelson Mandela was also part of the Politburo. Now, Politburo is not Soviet for Boy Scouts. Lucian, your thoughts?
I don't know if he was part of the Politburo, if we're still at Mandela, but I do know that he was a routine figure at the Lomonosov Institute, which at the time was far more, how should I call it, political than it is today. I mean, today it is a very, even by modern Russia standards, well, if there's anything modern in Russia, but whatever, by contemporary Russia standards, is a very technocratic place. But at the time, it was very much politicized. And you can see, especially in Mandela, but generally the elite of the ANC, you can see the training in Leninism in particular, but also what they call post-Stalinism, because the way the ANC functioned after it took power, it wasn't significantly different from what we've seen communists doing in Poland, in Romania, and in the western parts of the Soviet Union, that is to say, present-day Ukraine, present-day Belarus, present-day Lithuania, which is to try to simply turn the existent order upside down. So to put it, to give an example that definitely matches the South African experience, except it happened here. Immediately after communists settled into power in Romania, one of the first things to do, besides disarming the population, of course, was to change the way you could advance in your career. So if your parents had been kulaks or people who owned land, boers in South African context, then no education for you, sorry. You don't have healthy origin. That was the legal term, the file of healthy origin. And having a healthy origin meant that your parents preferably were illiterate peasants. If your parents were illiterate peasants, then there would be diversity, equity, and inclusion quota for you, and you would graduate no matter how dumb you were.
So affirmative blaction, does this sound kind of familiar?
Yes, something like that, yes, except it wasn't about race because, well, there wasn't much multiracial diversity in Romania or Poland in the late 1940s, but it was by class here. But it's exactly the same type of pattern that the ANC implemented in 91, 92, and especially after 94, exact same pattern that occurred here from 1948 until 1953 when Stalin died, and then to a lesser extent, but still going on all the way till late 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly the same thing. And the purpose, and it was a stated purpose, I mean, at the very least, the Soviets were very honest about this. The stated purpose was to turn the existent order upside down, and they meant it very literally. So that
Mm-hmm.
meant the lowest classes should be put to rule by any means necessary at any cost, and the existent higher class and their descendants be purposefully made into lower class at any cost by any means necessary. Like, for instance, the intellectuals that have been jailed during the years of Stalinist repression after World War II, most of those people died in poverty or in very low menial jobs, way beneath their qualifications. They were never fully restored.
I spoke to someone who told me that their father was a university professor before communism, and then after communism, what they did was they reduced all their salaries, and he was put on the same pay scale as the janitors.
Yeah, but at least he was allowed to remain a university professor, so that's a happy case. Most of the time, they were made literally into janitors.
Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. So let's have a look then. Joe Slovo, South African Communist Party. He was the head of the
Mhm,
SACP, trained in Moscow, right?
mhm.
And he wasn't there to learn how to bake cookies for sure. Chris Hani. Now, Chris Hani was obviously killed by a Polish citizen, obviously in South Africa. I think he's just been released. And now, Chris Hani is an interesting name. We're not sure exactly why he was killed. Let's say in total, but
Yeah,
he was
Wikipedia says he was killed by a white right winger. I'm sure that's true.
right. Of course, everyone's right wing. I'm right wing.
Mm.
I'm a good grief, I'm a white supremacist right
No,
winger.
I was curious because I knew that Mr. Slovo is routinely crap is being promoted by him about him. Like, for instance, Wikipedia says he was widely misrepresented as a KGB colonel or Russian secret agent and attracted a great deal of press after his return. Now, true, granted, he wasn't a KGB colonel, and granted, he wasn't a Russian secret agent. He was just a Russian agent.
Yes,
Nothing secret about it.
they all were Russian agents in one shape, way, or form or another. Yeah,
Yes,
I mean,
but Mr. Slovo in particular, I mean, the guy had intelligence training, and although he didn't show up in Moscow to pick up his official diploma, he is a graduate of the Russian intelligence school. I mean, that's just it's just the way it is. It's nothing secret about it. So yeah, sure, he wasn't a Russian secret agent. He was just a Russian agent.
just a Russian agent. Yeah,
Mhm,
openly so.
mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
and Leninis, I'm sorry to hear about your friend, but yes, standards have sunk heavily, badly in South Africa. In the last few years, the country is far worse off under the ANC than it ever was under the white government. I can assure you, my family, my grandmother, who's 97, she misses apartheid. I would, my family, I can tell you, and this is not just colored families like myself, but even black families. They had better healthcare, they had better access to doctors, they had better access to medicines, they had better access to jobs, they had, in fact, longer life expectancy. They had better access to food, they had cheaper food, they had guarantees of work. They actually had better education under the white government than they do today. Now, of course, everyone can shout and claim and qualify all of these, but for the most part, I know even black people are starting to say, man, I would vote for the white nationalist government tomorrow if they would go back on the ballot because things were better, things were safer, things were.
I encountered on Twitter a few days ago and retweeted it because we already knew that we're going to do this. There was a graph that said that there are more racial laws today in
Yes,
South Africa than during apartheid. Even during the most repressive periods of apartheid, there were still fewer racial laws on the books
yeah,
than today. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it sounds true prima facie, to use an intellectual term.
seems to be the
Um,
case. Yeah,
yeah, it does sound true prima facie for the simple reason that um, the Leninist way of doing things is to codify every single minute thing and then try to be as rigid and as determined as possible to introduce it, which of course, because Marxism-Leninism is after all a German ideology, and like every other German socialist ideology, it is very much obsessed with having things as codified as possible.
Right. Yeah, you can go to, I'll drop this link in the chat. You can get more information about that. I haven't had a chance to examine this in detail, to watch this, but this is Race Law in South Africa, 30 years into non-racial democracy. And of course, it's become even more racialized than before.
Yeah, I posted in the private because I can't post in the public chat. I posted a link from the Telegraph on Nelson Mandela from 2012. So 13 years ago, it was allowed to talk about these things. It was before political correctness hit the Telegraph newsroom, which basically discusses the communist terrorist part. So there's that.
Jews, hold on. I see what I'm doing wrong here. Let me just kill that. Here we go.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yes. Yeah. No, he was definitely a communist. He was a bomb maker. And even if he personally didn't perhaps make those bombs or didn't plant those bombs, although we think he did, he was responsible for the deaths of innocent civilians, innocent people.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the hits just keep on coming. But yes, was a Communist Party member after all. Yeah. So this link I dropped in the chat. You can learn more about it. This is the graph you were referring to here. This is during the apartheid
I think
period.
so, yes.
It's about here, and then this is where it currently is in South Africa. That there's just been this growth in the amount of laws. You can also have a look here. The ANC has failed to de-racialize. They were going to make everything the rainbow nation. And DEI just makes people more racist. I mean, we know that from research shows that DEI just creates more racism.
Absolutely. I mean, it does show that how schizophrenic general global culture has become. I mean, now we need a study to tell us what is self-evident. I mean, there is a study now, a peer-reviewed study, and now even the leftists have come to accept this, that having DEI makes people more racist. But I was talking about this in 2015 on my channel. I'm like, guys, you are creating more racism. And like, oh, but do you have a source for that? Oh, come on, it's self-evident. If you nag people into oblivion about how they're either great or terrible because of their race, well, eventually you're going to create racial resentment into them, either against someone else or against themselves or whatever. But it will increase the overall amount of racism. That's just self-evident. But no, we needed a study. We needed the sociologists to spend several millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to make a study to tell us, well, what we already knew, which is, yes, actually, having racial sensitivity classes and DEI crap eventually will turn more people into racists. So, of course.
Right. No, agreed. So Nelson Mandela was a guerrilla. He was not a peacemaker. In 1961, he co-founded the armed wing of the African National Congress, known as the Umkhonto weSizwe, the Spear of the Nation.
The Spear of the Nation, yeah.
So he was not someone who was there to make peace. He was there to make war. And no time during his presidency did he ever, and before or after, did he ever forswear violence as a method. At no point did he say, I give up violence as a political tool, because they've always used violence as a political tool. Right. Chris Hani trained in the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what's interesting is he was responsible, along with two others, the other being Jacob Zuma and another name that I won't mention here, for what's known as Camp Quattro. Camp Quattro was technically a training camp for the ANC cadre, where they trained the Umkhonto people, but also it became known as a torture camp. So people who were disloyal to the ANC were sent there, and they were brutally tortured. Nobody knows how many people were killed there. Nobody knows how many people were tortured. Apparently it was sadistic. It was murderous.
Mm-hmm.
It was horrific. Now, Nelson Mandela in 1994 ordered an investigation into this. And of course, Jacob Zuma, who also was president of the country, and Chris Hani, who were running Camp Quattro, refused to comply.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hani actually was dead when the investigation was ordered. But yes, his underlings who are still alive did everything they could to obstruct the investigation, even the sham investigation, because let's face it, an investigation under Mandela would not have been very thorough. Yeah. But even a sham investigation made mostly to please the Western partners of the newly created ANC government, even that would have been too much for Hani's underlings who are still alive in 1994. I've seen some posthumous investigations, most of them done by people like us. So, not particularly credentialed, but more interested in, hey, what the hell happened there after all? And some of their work methods have eventually been accepted in various sociological departments. The number of people incarcerated there is apparently in 6 figures. The numbers of deaths is in low 5 figures in the concentration camp. Yeah, so but it's still an early estimation. I guess if we're ever going to find out the truth, we're going to have to wait until the legacy of ANC disappears, I suppose.
Wow, that is shocking, though. So now, as I said, the ANC murdered more people. That we know this, that the ANC murdered more people in just the 9 years between 85 and 94 than the apartheid regime murdered during their entire government. Now, of course, everyone's going to say, well, the apartheid government was vicious and brutal and nasty. Well, the best figure, the worst figure that can be thrown at them for the entire reign of that government for their political murders is 600 people. The ANC, we can go into the tens of thousands. Depends how you do the stats. But the ANC ultimately led to violence that killed well over 50,000 people that we know of. And of course, the ANC government, now, if you think about it, under the apartheid government, we had, now no one has the exact figures, it's hard to pin down, but let's say we had a murder rate, take a number, 400 a year under the apartheid government. We had a murder rate of 400 a year. So the ANC comes to power, Nelson Mandela comes to power, the murder rate rises to 25,000 a year. That's winning, right? If you're black. So I don't know how going from 400 to 25,000 is any kind of success. Now, of course, today they will redefine the statistics. What they do is they change the stats, they misreport it, and so on. I used to have access to these stats through contacts of mine back in the day. But basically, if you die on the spot, it's murder. If you die 3 minutes later in the ambulance, it's aggravated homicide or aggravated assault.
Or death during medical care.
Yes, it's recategorized, so it's no longer murder. So they fix the murder problem. So this is the kind of things that they do, right? Now, of course, and it's come down though. It's 19,000 to 20,000 a year now. So we're winning. We're 30% better than we were 5 years ago. That's fantastic. 19,000 a year. Or just make up the stats as you like. So,
I mean, even going by official stats, I mean, during the autumn of 2023, there were between 85 and 90 murders per day. So in a week, it was already a lot more than in a whole year under apartheid. It boggles my mind. I mean, you guys need a Bukele there, really. You need a Nayib Bukele, because even in the context of South Africa, where things are a little bit more complicated sociologically than they were in El Salvador prior to Nayib Bukele's presidency, at the end of the day, it's still a tiny number of people who commit most of the murders. And if you just build a big enough gulag to keep all of those caged, then suddenly the murder rate will go down. It's really that simple.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, look, the purpose of a system is what it does. If the system is killing people, that's what it's intended to do.
Yeah, pretty much.
If the system is raping women, that's what it's intended to do. It's that simple, really. What it continues to do is what it's supposed to do. So Ronnie Caswell became eventually a government minister, and he was head of security at one point, head of the South African Intelligence Service. He received training in the USSR. Jacob Zuma, who is illiterate, if you watch the videos of this man trying to say six-figure numbers, trying to count, they are hysterical, but also humiliating if you're South African. People used to show these to me and laugh, and it was just embarrassing. So he was trained in Moscow in counterintelligence by the KGB, right? And he joined the Communist Party when he was 17, I believe, in 1962, or when he was 20, in 1962. Thabo Mbeki, former president, at least he was an economist, and actually made sense. His economy was actually decent. He didn't crash the economy. He was a Politburo member as well of the Communist Party.
One more thing to be said about Casrills. The guy was he did receive some military training in Moscow, yes, but his intelligence training came out of the Stasi. That's where he graduated. in East Berlin. Yes, the Ministry of State Security of the DDR schooled him into how to integrate into left-wing movements in the West. And upon graduation, he was sent, I think, to London, if my memory is not fuzzy, to start working into the anti-apartheid movement as one of the many infiltrators schooled in the Eastern Bloc and sent into left-wing movements in the West. It was part of Mr. Kazrils was part of the same graduation group that also mostly permeated the anti-nuclear movement in West Germany, which of course then, just like today, had the same purpose, which is to make Germany dependent on Russian gas. Because let's not forget, the Eastern Bloc had a lot of these materialistic goals in mind. The ideology was, at the end of the day, subservient to the materialist goals, the materialist purposes. And in the case of the anti-apartheid movement, at least from the perspective of the Stasi, the purpose was not necessarily ideological. I mean, maybe Moscow saw it as ideological, maybe, I don't know. But from the DDR perspective, the purpose was very much materialistic, which is to open the transport routes in that region of the world. It was mostly materialistic, like it is the case generally, again, with German socialist ideologies. It's very much materialistic.
Yeah. Now, South Africa fought a bush war against the communist-funded groups that were trying to enter into Southwest Africa, now Namibia, and also ultimately South Africa and Mozambique. And the South African military back then was highly competent. These were very skilled men. These were very dedicated men. These were highly trained, very effective. And of course, which is one reason that I guess they had to gut the military so that the military was no longer effective. But we had some very, very good people. But they fought a bush war and they were very successful. They were possibly the best bush fighters of the era. And the ANC was advised, of course, by the Vietnamese, because they went and trained in Vietnam. They trained in communist China. They trained with the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese taught them how to fight against a developed Western power, because the Vietnamese had fought the Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And those lessons were taught to the ANC, and they said, don't fight a bush war. You'll lose. What you need to do is take your fight into the neighborhoods, take them into civil land, drop bombs under bridges, drop bombs in schools, drop bombs in churches, supermarkets, blow things up, blow up cars on main streets in Johannesburg. Do things of that type, make it into a war campaign that is not a guerrilla, that is a guerrilla warfare campaign. Also, so this is why the ANC was not a peaceful organization. The whole point was to make war in an unconventional manner that the military couldn't easily get hold of them, fight them. Also, any thoughts on that before I go on?
It's basically terrorism. I mean, until 2001, well, academically until 1990, but conventionally until 2001, this was the standard definition of terrorism. It was things done by a government or government-like organization. That was the definition of terrorism. Nowadays, one lone wolf gets to be labeled as a terrorist, but no, terrorism is exactly what the ANC was doing, which is a very organized campaign into terrorizing the population. RJ says, like Islamic terror, yes and no, because it does depend. Not every single crime committed by a Muslim is terrorism. Again, if it is part of an organized campaign, then I mean, I insist on precision of language. If it's a part of an organized campaign, like it was the case with ANC, or like it is the case with the militias in the Middle East, most of them Islamic these days, yes, those are terrorism, but not every single crime is a terrorist act necessarily.
Right. Now, a couple of quotes with regard to the ANC. Communists within the ANC should lead the ANC to the goals of the Communist Party. They were serving the Communist Party line. They were serving the communist agenda. They were 80s revolutionary communists. Just something to bear in mind. You've got to listen to Winnie Mandela, Nelson Mandela's ex-wife. She was a murderous woman. She ordered killing. She definitely had people killed. You've got to listen to her talk about communists. She always talks about, no, if you're a communist, what happens is you're someone with angel's wings who wants to do the good and help people. That's what communists do. Communists believe in people. They want to help people. They want to bring good into the world. They're just the sweetest little goodie. You got to listen to this woman speak about communism, and they indoctrinated millions of black people into believing in, including my mother. I must sadly say this. My mom was a big ANC supporter and she believed all of this stuff, sadly. So yeah, so there's a personal issue there for me. So the Soviet Union was very much involved in what was happening in the ANC. Watch the documentary I mentioned earlier, Tainted Heroes, you will learn a great deal. Now, point to make here, there was a German book, and this is the crux of most of what I'm going to talk about here. A German book was published in 1988 by a German immigrant who lived in the country and saw the changes that were happening. And don't forget, I grew up in South Africa. I am South African. I was there for the riots. I was there during the massive riots from 85 especially. I remember those days very, very well. The fires, the bullets, the tear gas, being caught in those situations. I've run from the police, etc., etc. The mass demonstrations and so on. And I believed all of these things until I started to take a critical look at the history, the influences. There were many groups like the UDF, United Democratic Front. That was just an ANC front, it was just a communist front, which was serving the ANC purpose because the ANC was a banned organization. Any thoughts there, Lucian? I see you nodding your head. No. Halbo must be trying to disrupt things. What's your opinion about Magnus Vlan's connection with Pedophile Island? I have no idea. I've never heard of that. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know, and I don't particularly care right now. I mean, what's your connection with Pedophile Island? Were you there? You know, I mean, we can all make accusations. I have no idea. So, yeah. So let me see. Yeah, Winnie was a horrendous person. Nelson had to dump her. Yeah, no, she was simply bad for optics. Nelson was just more discreet about his violence. That's all.
Yep.
Right. So a German book published about how benevolent the white giant of Africa actually was, because we've been given a very partial, very biased view of South Africa, the South African government. I've met many Afrikaners in my day, and they're very nice people. Many of them, strangely enough, very nice people. They have strong family values. They're very kind. They're very open-hearted once you get to know them. They're generous. They're polite. So sure, you can find bad things about anybody, but if I had to choose whether I would hang out with a bunch of Afrikaners or a bunch of black people, it's like, would you want to hang out with the Palestinians or hang out with the Israelis? Man, for me, that's an easy choice. I've hung out with the Palestinians, and they're insane. So
it really does depend. I mean, you made this distinction about half an hour ago, so I'll just throw that distinction back at you. At individual levels, probably there's not a big problem. As a culture, it's usually a problem.
Correct. Actually, fair point.
Yeah, because I hang out with the Palestinians in Ramallah and in Gaza, and I had a blast. It was quite fun. Okay. But ultimately, would I go to the mosque or, quite frankly, to the church with them? No. Would I join any of their NGOs or their even non-political causes or more technocratic things? Oh, hell no. So can we smoke shisha together? Yeah, sure. Let's go to a party, a beach party, whatever. Sure, not a problem. But if we're going to get into more serious stuff, then probably no. Probably no.
Right. Actually, let me just go up. That's a different document. I'll bring up the details of the book and everything. I'll drop that in the link later. But let's talk about this. In 1972, right? Now, this guy collected all the statistics. I believe he was a doctor. He collected all the stats. So in 1972, South African blacks owned 360,000 cars, which means they had the wealth to afford them, to maintain them, and they were available to them. This is more than the entirety of the African continent combined. South Africa was providing cars to blacks who could buy them and use them and run them, which was more cars than all of Africa combined, according to the stats in the book. Now, the monthly income of blacks per capita was 352 rand per month in South Africa, whereas Malawi and Mozambique, which were, flirting with communism, especially Mozambique, was less than 20 rand a month. 20 rand is roughly $1.1. Okay, $1.1 today's exchange rate. Right. Now, interestingly, as you'll see from the statistics, the wealthiest blacks in the world were American blacks, because America was obviously the world's powerhouse, economic powerhouse. The second wealthiest blacks on earth were South African blacks. Now, for the most oppressed black people in history, in the most racist country on earth. It's crazy how these were the second wealthiest black people on the planet.
Mhm. Yeah,
Doesn't make
we see this today as well. Now, of course, with the political events of the last 3 months, more mainstream sources just started suddenly shutting up about this. But if you rewind the tape into, I don't know, January 2024, you could still hear this about how bad things are for the minorities in the US. Whereas if you look at, okay, let's look at per ethnic group, and suddenly there's like what, Indian Americans, Indians from India being the most wealthy, most prosperous ethnic group, followed by Nigerian Americans. So, but I do have to push back a little bit on this because on one hand, yeah, that's probably true. I mean, it does sound true. It's definitely true in the US and probably was true under apartheid as well. But my pushback is always, okay, so what? The line goes up. So what? Because, when we took down communism here in Romania and in other places in the far eastern part of the Eastern Bloc, the standard of living actually dropped. In the early 1990s, we were poorer than we were in the 80s. And the discussion was a very correct one. Who cares? Yeah, sure, the line goes down. Yeah, but we're now free. That's more important. So
right.
Even that's why I always stay away from these kinds of materialist arguments. Yeah, sure, South African blacks were wealthier during apartheid. That's probably true. But they will correctly reply, the anti-apartheid activists, well, so what? We have a gilded cage. We're not free. I mean, the thing is that to defeat this kind of rhetoric that apartheid was the supreme evil, you have to defeat it morally, not materialistically.
Mm.
Because,
Well,
but materialistically, of course, I suppose it's easy to defeat. But
yeah,
so
well,
what?
we've also got, like, I mean, I've got facts we can work with, facts, evidence, rather than rhetoric, let's say. I mean, so we can come follow the evidence, follow the numbers, follow the money,
You don't
and have
understand.
some practical
No,
policy.
no, no. That may be good enough for the Spurgs online, but it's not good enough for the average person. Trust the propaganda expert here. In propaganda, perception is reality. If
Sure.
people think they're poor, then they are poor. No matter how many objective facts you throw at them, telling them that, look, you're
Yeah,
actually
we're
not
not going to
poor at
convince them
all.
anyway. Well, I
Yeah,
doubt we're going to convince them. I mean, these people have died. And look, in South Africa, you go on Twitter, you read South African Twitter, you look at the blacks
I did that.
talking on Twitter. I mean, you're not going to convince them. These people
Yeah.
are dyed-in-the-wool idiots.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
but the thing is that I disagree that you can't convince them. I think you can. But what the opposition to those people did in the last decade, in the last several decades, was just inappropriate. Not wrong, but inappropriate. In the sense that while it is factually correct, it doesn't feel correct. And if it doesn't feel correct, then it will not convince anyone. So
Yeah.
what I'm basically trying to urge you to do is find a way to deliver things that feel correct.
Okay, well, not right now because this is what I have prepped and ready to go. So next time round, I'll have a look at those and discuss those. But everyone poses a one-sided argument, and we'd like to look at the other side of the argument. Everyone
Sure.
brings in very heated emotional issues. I'm trying to say, okay, let's look at some facts. Let's just compare facts. Let's start with that. We can. So black people, for instance, the government was subsidizing hospitalization for blacks. A black South African could get a heart transplant operation, a heart valve surgery, right, for free, effectively, right?
Mhm.
So sorry, for just so the for just, I believe it was $1, the equivalent of $1.
Mhm.
Okay, um, for just more than $1. Yeah, for just more than $1. In the United States, under their healthcare system, you paid $15,000 for such a surgery, and Pretoria hospitals were subsidizing these. The white government was subsidizing these for blacks in the country to the tune of 2,000 and 3,000 of these per year. So black workers earned a significant portion of the GDP. They brought in a great deal of money, 32% of the total wages in South Africa, right? So there was money going around, all right? So I don't look at necessarily every single fact here, but the UN paid 298 million to underdeveloped countries. South Africa, in that same period, spent more than double that, roughly double that, nearly $600 million on the development of black areas. South Africa spent a huge amount of money trying to uplift the black population. Few people realize that blacks don't value education. All of that education money spent in Africa is wasted. Right now, Kenya might have come to the table and woken up Rwanda as well. They've actually realized, hold on, some of these Western European white ideas are actually great ideas. We should follow those because they work. They produce civilized cultures. However, black culture, as is in South Africa, vilifies white people. It vilifies white culture. You try to educate yourself, they accuse you with a slur of you're trying to be white. So you try to get educated, people will hold you back. It's the crabs in a bucket problem. They will pull you back. They will drag you down. So there's very little benefit to this money that people are paying. But South African government was trying to uplift people. It was building huge amounts of classrooms, schools, to bring the blacks into the middle class. Now, you would have had to have been in the country, but you would see that even though these laws were on the books, they were not enforced. Even though the laws existed, the government was, as the black population started to move into the middle class, as they started to become more educated and more westernized, the laws were less and less and less enforced because they were no longer necessary. Your thoughts, Lucia? You seem to have some thoughts.
Yeah, it does sound very similar to what Mr. Smith, the last white prime minister of Zimbabwe, used to say that, yeah, sure, well, when it was the discussion on whether to keep the old version of Rhodesia or go to populist democracy. And his argument was, and he maintained that argument all the way until he died, look, eventually we'll get there, but in order to get there, we first need a better prepared population. And for now, this was in late 70s, that's still not the case in Zimbabwe/Rhodesia. Therefore, no, we should not be doing that today. But yes, eventually that should be the case. And of course, he didn't get his way. Mugabe came into power, and we all know how that worked out. But at the very least, and this is true even today, the Zimbabwe still holds the most educated workforce in the southern region of Africa, because at least they kept the education system that they inherited from the colonial era. They didn't upgrade it that much, but they also didn't destroy it. And it turned out that that was a good enough idea. And now you have them. It's really funny. And you don't find them on Twitter. You have to go on Facebook groups where every year when there is the 100th anniversary of Mr. Smith's birth or whatever, some radio host posts a picture of the last white prime minister and said, well, maybe he had a point. And then you'll find thousands or tens of thousands of comments, overwhelmingly from black Zimbabweans, who was like, yeah, actually, the guy had the point. Now we're somewhat prepared for a universal democracy, but man, we were not prepared 40 years ago. And if he had his way, then probably things would have been better. But the thing is that it's also a huge difference in mentality. That's why I always make the face sign that signals mild disapproval, because I understand you try to speak to an exclusively Anglo audience, but I'm also very insistent on precision, because, you know, when you say blacks, it's always a kind of problem because, well, there's Rwanda, which is also a very black country that doesn't function like that. There's Kenya, there's Nigeria, also doesn't function like that. Then there are also countries that are somewhat in between, like Niger, for instance, which kind of doesn't function like that, but it's also very susceptible to Russian shilling and Russian propaganda, as we've seen very recently, in fact. So it's a little bit more complex. That's why I always insist that it's more of a mentality issue than a race issue.
Well, I mean, Africa, if you try to develop a black person to become more like a westernized European person, their culture vilifies them. They suffer. I know, I've been through it. I know exactly what it's like, right? So unfortunately, there's that. The ANC also reversed all of these policies. The ANC went back on all of that.
Yes.
So they basically, I mean, how do you take...
Of course they did. It's the inversion of the current order mentality that I was explaining an hour ago. Yes.
How do you take people, think about this, how do you take a people that 20 years ago didn't know what shoes were? Right? How do you take a people that 20 years ago had never heard of toothpaste, toothbrush, electricity, shoes, socks, pants, clothes, navigation, roads, buildings that weren't made of sticks or mud? How do you take those people and 20 years later say, okay, guys, you are now joining the first world and you are now going to wear a suit, and you're going to become an accountant and a chartered accountant, and you're going to start building rocket. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense.
Yes, although there are some examples like that, although even those had some more, or still do have some intermediary steps. Let me introduce you to South Korea. South Korea was, okay, maybe not buildings with sticks and mud, but very much close to that. South Korea was, for lack of a better term, a fucking shithole in the
Singapore,
50s.
go to Singapore 50 years ago.
Yeah, okay. Singapore is a special case, and we all know it. But South Korea is a big enough place that can serve as an example. And it was more or less uplifted as a result of Western colonialism since the 1950s. If you show to a South Korean Zoomer today some footage from 1950 in Seoul, they will not believe it. They'll say it's AI generated to make Korea look bad or something.
Wow.
It's an entirely different universe, not just an entirely different country, right? But South Korea did not go to full democracy at all. They went nominally to democracy in the 90s, but de facto, South Korea even today is basically benevolent fascism. About 80% of the economy is like three companies that are led in a feudalistic manner, very hereditary monarchy type of companies. The politics is, okay, a little bit more open, but definitely not democratic, as we've seen with the constant jailing of the former presidents, coup d'etats, attempted coup d'etats, martial laws. Even just this month, there is another scandal with the president who imposed martial law and then got outvoted by the parliament, and now they can't arrest him because he has his own Praetorian Guard that protects him. So, even as modernized and wealthy as it is, South Korea these days, it still has very much third worldish reflexes.
That's a mentality that comes back to the mentality issue. So
yeah.
With apartheid means separation. Apartness. You can literally translate it as apartness, separation. However, if you go back to the days of the FW of Verwoerd, right, the guy who was a very famous apartheid president, I think back in the 60s, he spoke of it as good neighborliness. He said, think of it as good neighborliness. Good fences make good neighbors.
Good neighbors have good fences, yeah.
And he said that basically we are neighbors we have incompatible, I'm paraphrasing here, but we are neighbors that have incompatible ideas. We are different strata of society, we're different levels of development. So we're going to give you your own homeland, the space that you have called home, you build, and they funded. I've been to many of these homelands when I was younger. The government funded, they provided billions ultimately to these places. They had their own governments. They were supposed to develop roads, infrastructure, agriculture, electricity, lighting, and so on. And of course, you know what the black politicians did? They bought themselves big houses, BMWs, and holidays on the Côte d'Azur, right? And maybe yachts on the Med for all I know, and private planes, who knows? And hookers in Paris, very probably. So instead of developing their culture, because the biggest impediment to black development is not white people, although there are two white people that are to blame for most of the dysfunction in Africa. They're called Marx and Lenin. Those two guys definitely bear a lot of responsibility, but corruption, communism and corruption are the two major issues. And this is also partly because of indoctrination, education, bad education, but also culture. White culture tends to be less corrupt. Black culture is extremely corrupt. So now I'm not here to so now the budget for black education increased every year from 1970 to almost 30% more than any other government department. The apartheid government was extremely serious about uplifting blacks to the middle class, to provide them with education so they could join in with the common culture, the Western European culture of the white class. Now, they wanted to protect their particular culture, which I think they have every right to do. However, they said, look, we have fences, and this is good neighborliness, and we learn to get along. Because, a simple example, you have Zulus and you have Xhosas, and they hate each other, and they will murder each other if they get together, which was a common situation. You saw this in Rwanda with the Hutus and the Tutsis.
Yes.
Until eventually the government said, hey, you know what, we're not Hutus, and we're not Tutsis, and we're not this group, and that. We are just Rwandans. Screw all of those labels. We're Rwandans. We're one people. Forget it. Move on. South Africa has not done that. But the Zulus, the Xhosas, the Ndebele, and all they would murder each other. And I don't mean they would have a slight dispute. There would be blood in the streets.
Mhm.
So, for instance, if you had a mine and you had a group of Zulus, they would all have to be put on one shift, so that when they came out on shift, from the front of the mine, from the back, from the other entrance, the Xhosas went in. Because if they were down there, they would kill each other. Because that is the tribal mentality. That's what tribal people do. They're not very advanced. And for white people to go, well, we need to embrace diversity. And these people are, they've got such wonderful cultures. Look, they eat maize. Like, I don't care. Maize, who gives a shit? So, Lucian, you're nodding your head?
Yeah, pretty much. I understand the mentality behind it, and ultimately the reason why this will continue to have a controversial outlook is because, well, first of all, it's been less than 100 years. As I'm sure you're aware, there is that thing called the 100 years window. After 100 years, any controversial event, no matter how controversial and how murderous it is, it can be discussed dispassionately. Well, apartheid ended only 31 years ago. Well, 33, depends on how you count, but whatever. So it's still not been 100 years. So as a result, there is always going to be an emotional reaction. And secondly, until that 100 years passes, we as Europeans, whatever, we still haven't gotten over our own problems with each other effectively. So as a result, it still lends credence to the counter argument coming usually from the Westoid left, which is, well, yeah, but at the end of the day, the Germans and the French don't get along that much. So why exactly should the Xhosas and the Zulus get along that much? And I'm like, yes, but we cheer against each other in a football match, and okay, maybe some skirmishes in the bar. But it's been a while since we've been creating rivers of blood in the streets, I would say. So, there is not getting along with each other has degrees in itself. And that is probably the part that we haven't been making clear enough. We've come to equate minor squabbles and memery, which is the norm here in Southeastern Europe. I mean, you should see a chat where there is Hungarians, Romanians, Serbs, and Bosniaks. And the language there is significantly harsher than most people can imagine. But then the exact same people, if they meet on a stadium or whatever, they usually drink with each other and make jokes, and that's pretty much the end of it. And what I'm trying to say here is that if there's one thing Slavoj Žižek had a point, it's this one: creating more ethnic slurs advances civilization, because ultimately civilization began when one man decided to curse instead of pick up the stone or the bat.
Actually,
right?
Fair point.
And the question is, how do we get back to that? Because the Westoid left, the academic Western left, has demonized any sort of ethnic-based or racially charged or whatever you want to call it joke, right?
Right.
It's a supreme crime to call a Bosniak a Balkan nigger, right? It's a supreme crime. Whereas here, it's the reason we've stopped killing each other. I mean, it's quite literally why we haven't seen any flare-ups of warfare in this part of the world, which is a very much a tumultuous part of the world, rife in warfare. I mean, World War II is just one other war in the last 100 years. We've had so many of them, a lot more than just that. And the reason we've stopped doing that is because we've normalized ethnic slurs.
Yeah,
And,
I mean, you
and
can't
jokes.
go to prison if you do that. So
Yeah. There you go. There. Yeah.
You know?
So you have two sets of bad ideas. The set of bad ideas coming from the West, which is any ethnic slurs affects diversity negatively, therefore it's a crime, and the crabs in the bucket mentality already existent there. And you have a two clash of terrible ideas, and of course the result is going to be terrible as well.
Good points. So from 1955 to 1984, the number of black scholars increased from 35,000 to over 1 million in schools. Yeah. So in 88, 71% of the black adult population could read and write, versus in Kenya at that time, 47%, 34%, 38% in Egypt, and 34% in Nigeria. So on average, the white government was building 15 new classrooms in schools per day for black people. The
Mhm.
white government was very serious about getting black people educated. And of course, what the ANC and other groups did was, oh, you're trying to make them white. Oh, you're trying to undermine their culture. Oh, you've got to leave them primitive cave dwellers because that's their true
Yeah,
culture.
the noble savage, what do you call it? Noble savage fantasy, I guess.
The
Um,
French stupid ideas.
and it's not just a stupid idea; it's a dangerous idea.
So
Now, I can sympathize with
just
the
one
portion.
more, Lucian. Prophet Muhammad did not teach equality. So please don't lie to me. I've read the Sharia, I know it extremely well. Islam views everyone else as the kafir. And his last sermon was written in, as far as we know, in the 1900s. His last sermon was not written when he was alive. He was dead for a long time when his fake last sermon, which tries to emulate the Sermon on the Mount, was written. So I don't have time for the bullshit. I'll put you in a timeout for 30 minutes and you can go away and think about whether or not you're going to tell the truth. Thanks. Sorry, back to you, Lucian.
Right. So the noble savage fantasy starts from a very understandable sentiment, which is, well, even if we believe we are better than those people, whether they're the Chosas or the uncontacted tribes in Southeast Asia or whatever, even if we believe we are better than them, why exactly should we impose necessarily our values upon them? Now, I can definitely sympathize with that
Mm-hmm.
sentiment. The problem is when that sentiment is taken to the level of policy. That is to say, not only we should be careful on imposing our values on other people, but we should be forbidden from even presenting them. And the
But
latter part is a huge issue
you also forget
because, go ahead.
black culture fought literally violently against development. Black culture is also so
Yes,
entrenched in its
yes,
identity. It literally violently fought against development. And then they go, why are we so poor? I mean, think about it. You had people on
just stop
ships with
being poor, mate.
technology from Europe, right? You had people on ships with technology coming on ships from far, far away, thousands of miles away, landing on your shores, and they find these, well, okay, cavemen, right? To use a
Simplify.
metaphor, you
Yeah.
find these cavemen, and then of course these cavemen don't want to be developed. They don't want to learn. They don't want to improve their culture. And then later on, they'll blame the people who came on ships for why they're so poor. It's like, why are we so poor and primitive? It's the white man's fault. It's like,
Mhm.
well, they tried to lift you up, but you decided not
You
to.
refused.
Yeah.
Effectively. And on a moral point, we need to find our balls somewhere and say, guys, you refused. While we shouldn't be taking your refusal as definitive, the thing is that since you refused, now we're going to do it our ways. And if you don't like it, well, tough. Because, again, I can definitely sympathize with the sentiment that even if we believe we are better, we should not necessarily attempt right off the bat to impose our value system upon other people. But by the same token, we should be permitted to present our value system and maybe they choose to adopt it, like it
Hmm.
happened in several places.
Right.
Starting with I don't know, even communist Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam is communist only in name at this point, and some of the posters that remind me of my childhood in communist Romania. But that's the end of communism. That's the extent of communism there. The rest of the economy is very much capitalistic, and for through a different incentive. I mean, the Vietnamese did not necessarily want to be Westerners, but they
Mhm.
wanted to be anything but not China. So anything but not China, but also good materially, well, there's not many other choices. So as a result, they voluntarily chose to pick and choose, yes, sure, because they didn't adopt the whole set of values from the West, but they did adopt a fair amount of it, but at their own pace. Now, is that colonialism? I don't think so. When someone else chooses to copy me, it's actually an expression of admiration, and it's not my fault.
Just
Although
give
I
me a
could, although I could
second,
say it's
please.
somewhat our merit, but
Jalaluddin Akbar, you're lying. There is major Christian persecution. There is also major Muslim rape of white girls happening in Europe and happening in the UK. Now, unfortunately, in Islam, under Sharia, lying is an obligatory duty. I am very well aware of what is happening, and very well aware of Islam. So, yeah, kindly just go away and stop bothering us.
To be fair, the commenter does have a point, because legally the United Kingdom is still not a Muslim country. So there's that. But once it will be a separate question. Anyway, so when someone else decides to adopt our values, that's an expression of love, not an expression of colonialism. But when someone decides to refuse them, then sure, we can respect their choice, but then we should not accept any blame for the result of their choice. That is to answer to your point of why are we poor, why are we primitive? Well, tough.
Yeah, this guy just said something else here. There's no such thing as. Yeah, this guy's just lying. So we have no interest in that. Okay, so. Right. So the Muslims are coming out today.
Okay, so if the Muslims are coming out, let's move to Israeli apartheid, so it gets funnier.
Okay, no, let me finish a few things here. So in 1985, there were 42,000 black students enrolled at South African universities. There were 5 black universities funded by the white government, and there were 28 higher education institutions. Soweto had a population of the southwestern townships, had 1.2 million residents, 5 modern stadiums. Pretoria had 600,000 whites, only had 3. The government actually provided more resources for the blacks. Right, Soweto had 365 schools, Pretoria had 229. In Soweto in 1978, 115 football fields. How do you think they got those if they were the most oppressed, poorest blacks on the face of the planet? The white government provided those. So 3 rugby fields, 4 athletic tracks, 11 cricket fields, 2 golf courses, 47 tennis courts, 7 swimming pools, 5 bowling halls, 81 basketball fields, 39 children's playgrounds, community halls, cinemas, and clubhouses. 300 churches, 365 schools, 2 technicons, which is a technical university, 8 clinics, 53 kindergartens, 11 post offices, and its own market. Interestingly, Baragwanath Hospital, which is now, the correct term is a shithole under the black government, the South African government built literally the most advanced, the most sophisticated training hospital in the world for the blacks. It had 3,000 beds, and black students could go there basically for free. Technically, is close enough for free to be educated as doctors, heart surgeons, state-of-the-art training, effectively for free. Accommodation, food, training, paid for by the white racist state, paying these guys to become the best doctors in the world to treat other black people for free. That sounds incredibly racist, or this it doesn't. What do you think, Lucian?
Now, again, I'm not particularly interested in these materialist arguments. I've already told you, I don't care. And I understand when the left replies with, yeah, so what? Because these kinds of arguments convince exactly nobody, as I said. Because I look at things through a propaganda lens. Because again, the facts have been known. No. The facts have been known for decades. Nobody cares about them.
I haven't seen these facts. I've seen no one ever discuss these. I have not seen.
No one cares. Again, it's the age of the short attention span. The only people still watching at this point in the streams are, at least in part, Spurgs, or who cared deeply about the topic, or they either like or they like one of us, or they're Muslims coming here to troll us. It doesn't penetrate the wider public because nobody cares at this point.
No. Tesseract, who's in South Africa, says international students stumbled over each other to do internship at Baragwanath.
Yeah, that's true.
It was state of the art.
Mm-hmm.
It was state of the art.
Yes.
Blacks could be treated for a cost of R2, which is what, roughly 15 cents US, for an unlimited period. So this just goes on and on. So 898 heart surgeries were done there in 1982. That's exclusively for blacks, right? They have the St. John Eye Clinic. They fixed eye problems for black people. There were 2,300 registered firms, 1,000 taxi operators, and 50,000 car owners in Soweto. So there was no shortage of money. There was no shortage of entrepreneurship. There was no shortage of loans. There were some very strong positives under the apartheid government wanted separation because it said, look, you know what? You guys live over there. You guys live over there. We'll live in the middle, because when you guys meet each other, you murder each other. How about we just separate you? That's a really good idea for separating people. Now, this is not to say that you didn't have white beaches. Everyone's going to go, well, but there were whites only beaches. And there were coloreds only beaches too. And there were some very nice beaches, I know, because I grew up on those beaches. And then, of course, you see, you have a lovely white beach where people behave and people don't get drunk. And then you have the black beaches where you see they indulge in fights where they get drunk, they break the bottles, and they kill each other with the broken bottles. They throw broken bottles, and do drugs, and leave needles lying all over the beach. And the blacks did that and the whites didn't. So I kind of like that idea that, when you guys grow up and stop doing stupid things, you can join us over here. But how about you guys get your act together? So there's an element of that good neighborliness, which really people didn't understand, but the blacks didn't. Obviously, they could propagandize this and gain propaganda coups out of it. But the simple fact is, the white government, laws like these were present in many places in the world.
Mhm.
The one mistake the white government made was to write them into law so they could point at them as a target. But these were common practices all over the place.
Yes,
And
it was one of the huge propaganda blunders
yeah,
because, look, we actually still do hold some of these practices today in Eastern Europe. It's just that the legislation is about behavior and not about ethnicity or race. And as a result, they still survive the test of modernity as well. And they're the exact same practices and the exact same way of doing things since the 1400s. Why the 1400s? Because that's when the gypsies showed up.
yeah. Apartheid was wrong, this guy says. Apartheid was wrong, and the ANC communism. No, communism has always been wrong. It's never been right. But apartheid had a lot that was right. I would vote, and I'm saying this honestly, I've said this, I will vote for the white government tomorrow if the 1984 white government was in the polls tomorrow. I mean, if they were there, if I could vote for them, hell, I'd vote for them, because anything is better than the ANC at this point.
Mm.
The ANC has destroyed the country. The economy is half, I believe, of what it was 15 years ago, right? There were very strong positives. The country was safe. The roads worked.
If you had calculated by purchase power parity, it's about a third of what it was at the end of the apartheid regime.
Yes. Yeah.
I know, minus 70% recession in a quarter of a century. Minus 70% recession in a quarter of a century. That's tough.
Self-governing states was supposedly a crime against humanity, Suburban Banshee, because they did that. And they said the whites are bad. No matter what the white government did, the whites were bad, the whites were evil, the whites were racist. What you had to do was you had to take the very competent white government out and replace them with uneducated, illiterate communist blacks who like to kill people with bombs. Somehow that made things better.
Yes, and what Suburban she doesn't seem to follow, or maybe he or she does but doesn't care, is that none of this would have been possible without the direct funding and guidance of the very intellectualized communist elite in Moscow and Berlin to a lesser extent. I mean, most of this was imposed also by, unironically, white colonists. It's just there was different type of white colonists.
Yes.
So instead of having a white government by white people born and raised there, you had a black government by people born and raised there, but educated in communist white countries by their communist white elite, imposing a totally foreign ideology, even more foreign than apartheid itself.
Yeah,
so,
in
of
fact,
course, it had worse results.
I mean, look, Africa has always been a market economy. Look at African trade. It's always been capitalist. It's always been a market economy.
Communism is quite literally anti-African. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's crazy. I need to do a talk on that. I mean, I actually have notes on that. I actually have slides prepared on that, but it's totally antithetical to African culture. So Garankuwa, another medical facility, which was there to help blacks, they did kidney transplants, right? They had laboratory units. 200 doctors were trained every year to help. What you fail to realize is the white government cared about the country. They loved the country. They were abandoned. They sacrificed. They've been killed. They've been murdered. The British had badly decimated their numbers. But they decided, you know what? We are going to established this country. Now, think about it. They started on the coasts. They worked their way inwards. The whites were in the country, what we call South Africa today. They moved north, right? They did the Groot Trek, the Great Trek north. They were there for at least 125 years before they saw their first black person, right? And when I say black, I'm talking tribal blacks. Now, this is not the small numbers. There were small numbers of the Strandloper, the Hottentots Hollanders, the Bushmen, right? The San. These people were being murdered by the Ngunis who came in from North Africa, from Central Africa, Central and Southern Africa. They came down, they started murdering the indigenous people of South Africa. These people then ran mostly into the desert areas. That's why the San lives now they live in the hot deserts, in these arid regions, because they were chased out by the blacks that were murdering them, right? And the other blacks were driven south. Who did they run to for protection? The white farmers. Who protected them? The white farmers. Who stopped the devastation, the slaughter? Think about it. The country had something like 4 million people that we know of in the 1800s. The blacks murdered half, as far as we know. Now, look, there's lots of studies. I've read several. I downloaded about 6 or 7 of these studies. As far as I can tell, they seem like propaganda. As far as I can tell, they seem like white people who are trying to make nice with the black government. Who knows? But roughly 2 million people, according to some reports, were murdered by the blacks. 50% of the population. You're not going to convince me that a bunch of primitive blacks who basically are barely out of the Stone Age, who don't know what shoes are good for your health, because they won't. So they got to the Fish River. They met the blacks, of course. There were battles.
I'm looking at the last element on that screen. South Africa provided the grain needs for its neighboring countries. In 1980, Zambia received over a quarter of a million tons of maize. This is really funny. In 2025, Zambia is the provider of food for the whole area, because in the meantime, they've learned how to make it themselves. And where they didn't, they had the luck of immigration. That is to say, white farmers from Zimbabwe who fled Mugabe. And the Zambian government had the wisdom to say, guys, how much land did you own in Zimbabwe? That much? Okay, we'll give you exactly that same amount of land as a property, not as a concession, with the condition that you produce the same amount of food here that you are producing in Zimbabwe. And a lot of the farmers did take them up of the offer, and the Zambian government held its end of the bargain, or at least it's still holding it 20 years later. And now Zambia is the provider of food for most of the region. Now, of course, things have started picking up pace again in Zimbabwe and Namibia as well. But for the most part, Zambia is now the provider of food. How things have changed. 40 years ago, they were importing from South Africa. Now they're exporting to South Africa.
Yeah, South Africa has become a net food importer because
yes,
a third of
which is weird.
I mean, a third of South Africa's farms have been destroyed. Farming is the most dangerous occupation in the country. Farmers are murdered all the time. People don't want to recognize it as the problem it is, where blacks are murdering white farmers.
Yes, socialism is the white man's control invention. The ANC are deified by Karl Marx. I love that. Yes, that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
No conservative or aristocratic white man came up with a better way of colonizing the minds of the third world than Engels and Marx. And Lenin, to a certain extent.
Vicious. Yeah. And Stalin was very interested in South Africa. Stalin, before his death, was very, very interested in South Africa. It's strategic. So Stalin was actually monitoring the events in South Africa, and he was funding and he was supporting all of these little crazy movements all around, which the white government was fighting against, because they were terrified of communism taking over the country.
Yeah, and that program by Stalin continued under Brezhnev and Khrushchev as well. I mean, that one never stopped, really. I mean, it stopped during Gorbachev, mostly because the Soviet Union ran out of money, not because they suddenly had a change of heart. Yeah.
Right. All right. Yeah, so few people realize the white government cared about the country. The white government loved the country. They had worked extremely hard. That country South Africa is mostly desert. You've got your coastal region, which is green, and then you've got heavy mountains. It's very mountainous and it's very desert area. Very hot, very arid. Most of the interior of South Africa, as we know it today, as we call it today, was actually infested by tsetse flies, which make you sick, give you sleeping sickness, wild animals, arid land which was not farmable. How many black farms were there before 1725? Like zero, right? So the whites came there, they irrigated the land, they worked the land, they improved the soil, the whites built that land with their own hands. They invested in that land. They loved the country. They still do. So then you have the blacks come along and just mess it all up. Now, as I said, the whites had been in the country 120, 125 years before they really found their first black people, these Ngoonies. And these guys were coming down south. The whites actually got there first. For the most part, the whites got there first. You can argue about areas like what we call KwaZulu-Natal today. But the whites got there first, and they did something with the land. What did the blacks do to develop South Africa? And excuse my French, but the answer is fuck all.
Mostly, but somewhere between jack shit and fuck all, yeah.
Fair assessment. I think it's roughly between those two. So the blacks did nothing, absolutely nothing to develop the country. The whites developed the country. Everyone owes them a thanks for that, I think. So, but of course, for that, they were vilified. Now, let's see. South Africa provided training for the airline personnel of Swaziland, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zaire, and the Comores, right? Because that's what racists did. In 79, when the train traffic to the Malawian capital was interrupted by rebels, South Africa sent transport aircraft with fuel drums to keep the economy going. South Africa also fought against a lot of these movements to keep Southern Africa free of communists.
Well, what a time! I mean, train traffic in Malawi. That's ancient history these days. Train doesn't run in Malawi anymore.
Not anymore, no.
I know.
Yeah. So yeah, in '86, 80,000 black businessmen were known to have visited Africa, right? South Africa, visit Cape Town to finalize business deals. Of course, that's more would have been in Johannesburg because Johannesburg was the business hub of the country.
Yes.
Still is. And South Africa, we spoke about the grain needs. South Africa donated. South Africa was providing aid and sustenance to the rest of Southern Africa as a good neighbor. Okay. Neutron Star says, I care. I didn't know any of this. Exactly. Because the ANC, that whole narrative, all those Swedes, all of those Greta Thunbergs who were, oh my God, those black people from the ANC are so amazing. I need to have sex with them. It's like because the white is so bad. They didn't know about or didn't care about the fact that they were just too worried about their virtue signaling to think about the facts, to think about the fact that they were supporting a communist, Soviet-trained communist government conduct a coup against the country.
Now, to be fair, Greta Thunberg probably does know because her parents are ideologically committed Bolsheviks and have been for a long time. And I think it was either her mother or her aunt that was part of the G8 or G8 group, which in Sweden was trying unironically to convince or force the Swedish authorities to voluntarily join the Soviet Union. That is to say, to become the Soviet Socialist Republic of Sweden. Now, fortunately, the political exponent of that movement, that would be Prime Minister Olof Palme, was turned into a good communist via assassination in the 80s, and that was the end of that movement. And also the Soviet Union going bankrupt didn't help either. But what I was saying is that probably Greta Thunberg knew exactly what she was doing.
Right.
Her followers probably didn't, but
yeah,
but she did.
So we've got new I've noted. So Lucian, is your family still Sufi?
No. Yes, I am related to Michel Vlsan, but he left the country and the family 100 years ago because potato, and he discovered Islam in France, and he didn't like much of what he found, so he was like, I'm going to make my own Islam with the blackjack and hookers. And alongside with René Guénon and other traditionalist authors of the time, this was again 1920s, late 1910s, early 1920s France, he developed his own philosophy, which today is forms part of the modern canon of some dervish orders and other Sufi adjacent Islamic sects. Yes.
Right.
But no, I have never been Sufi, and nobody in my family except Michel Vlsan is Sufi. But then again, Michel Vlsan died 50-something years ago. So
right. Yeah, I mean, obviously they were trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. Tesseract says,
"No, it's okay. It's a fair question."
Tesseract says, similarly with the Jews and Arabs, the Jews transform the desert wasteland into arable farmland. Muslims transform arable farmland into desert wasteland, or leave desert wasteland as desert wasteland. Exactly.
Roughly
So,
speaking, yes.
so you,
Although
yeah,
again, there are some exceptions there because it depends on ethnicity. The Muslim Persians are actually still very much into civilization. Muslim Turks are very much into civilization. But then again, we have to also have the question of how Muslim Turkey is today, which is not that much. So it's a bit more nuanced, but yes, roughly speaking, and it's always Muslims. I mean, the other non-Jewish minorities in Israel, like the Druze, for instance, they're very much into transforming desert wasteland into arable farmland as well. I mean, these days the farmer class in Israel is mostly Druze people.
On that point, the Arabs and the Muslims who live in Israel are the freest Arabs in the world. All the other Arabs live in the sun. Only 6% of the Arab countries have some degree of democracy. Most of them are just totalitarian states of one form or another.
It depends on how we define it, because and the reason I insist on this is because, for instance, neighboring Jordan, right, formerly Transjordan, today the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, it's nominally an autocracy, but in reality, with the exception of the king, pretty much everything else is in some way, shape, or form democratically decided. And the ideology there is actually not very different from the apartheid impetus, which is to say, look, we have a class of people who are still very much savages. Therefore, we cannot have total universal democracy because that would be fucking terrible. But as time goes on and more people in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan grow into civilization, we open more things to be decided democratically. We open the society even more.
Also I mean, the opportunities for growth is also limited by Islam. I mean, Islam just
Yes and no. I mean, in Jordan, for instance, it's probably I think it's the only place on earth that still has Christian religious tribunals. I mean, the way religious tolerance works in Jordan is really fascinating, and it's no longer seen anywhere else on earth at this point. But so it's a little bit more complicated, and I've seen it with my own eyes. For instance, I was visiting one of the more beautiful mosques in Amman, and some German guy showed up and was discussing the issue with Israel. And at some point, he was becoming too kebab in public, as I like to say. Basically, was spouting pro-Hamas propaganda. And the imam there were like, now it's time for you to shut up and go. And he insisted not to shut up and not to go. And suddenly, two very big gentlemen showed up, picked him up, put him in a van, and I have no idea where they went. But so that's why I'm saying by limited democracy. 100 years ago, you would have been arrested on the spot. Now, at least they ask nicely. There are some more things that have changed, and it's not just Jordan. There are some other places.
Yeah, but it could. The sad thing is these places could revert, and I mean the Muslim Brotherhood isn't exactly asleep there.
No, in the Muslim Brotherhood is a danger in Egypt, not in Jordan.
No, they are in Jordan. When I was working there, it was a problem. Just a question: the Christian Maoist comes along. I'm a Christian and a Maoist communist.
Oh, come on, that's a troll. Shut it down.
Yeah, obviously. I was just about to say, because that's exactly what I was thinking. You may as well. Communism is just public ownership. That's all. Like this fool really wants to tell us communism.
No. I mean, you spend too much.
So you're getting a 24-hour ban. F off. Go away. Stop wasting my time. Let's move on. So now at least 12 countries of Africa, okay, according to what was known as the Argus African News Service back then, I used to read the paper they produced, was so dependent on South African grain that a total ban on imports and exports would have destroyed them economically. What did the racist white government do? Well, it made sure that these people had food. Half of Lesotho's male population worked in South Africa, right? And
that's probably still true today because geography.
Very possibly. And they brought home half of Lesotho's treasury in the night. And of course, Lesotho is the rape capital of the world. That's it, hands down. They win the rape cap. It's the rape. And it's, let's see, is it black people? Oh my, we can't say that anymore. Sorry, it's black people. So we've got to change the topic now. right?
Let's not mention the HIV incidents because then we get banned off of YouTube.
Yeah, and the guy's got like 39 wives or whatever. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but the guy's got like 1 billion wives. So in the 1982-83 financial year, South African government budgeted 434 million rand. Now, there was a time when the rand, I remember when I was a kid, the rand was as strong as the dollar. In fact, the rand was slightly stronger at one point. Now it's roughly 18 rand to the dollar because they crashed the economy. So we went from having an economy where the dollar was 1-to-1 with the rand, where we now have got to pay nearly 20-to-1. It's insanity.
Yeah,
And
to give you a funny anecdote, when I went to Namibia last time, I believe it was like 6 years ago, I knew that the easiest way was because unlike Zimbabwe, Namibia is not disconnected from the global economy system. So I'm like, okay, fine, then I'll just go to an ATM machine and pull out some currency. So I did just that, but I was unlucky and then stumbled upon an ATM machine that was dispensing only rands. And I'm like, okay, it's not really that bad. It's mostly considered 1-to-1 in Namibia with the Namibian dollar. So, okay, maybe it's not that bad. But then it was like, well, actually, it is that bad because since 2017, now the rand is actually less than 1-to-1 to the Namibian dollar. so
Namibia is like Australia with like 5 guys and a sheep, or like 1 million sheep and 3 people.
yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, it's like 2 million people in total, and that includes the illegal immigrants. So it's not that many people.
It's an amazing country. I loved it there. I spent a month there. I mean, it's beautiful.
Yeah, no, I liked it too. And but with the exception of the Herero tribe, the people there are actually pretty much amazing. But the thing that the Namibian dollar is now stronger than the rand was just like honk honk.
Yeah, South Africa.
Stunning performance by the modern South African government for sure.
So we're nearly done with this list. So nearly done. So South Africa produced more electrical energy than Italy, as much crude steel as France, more wheat than Canada, and more wool than the US, more wine than Greece, and more fish than Great Britain. Now the country.
To be fair, more wine than Greece is easy because most of Greece is mountains. So
true, but South Africa no longer produces enough electricity for itself.
Yes.
In many places, you only go with electricity for 12 hours a day, and for up to 12 hours a day, you have no electricity. The government switches off the electricity, and then they move the power somewhere else, and you wait, maybe if you're lucky, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours. Maybe not in the morning. You have to wash in cold water, you boil in the kettle if you're lucky, and then you go to work. This is modern South Africa. We don't have enough power for ourselves. South African trains ran on more rail lines than West Germany, carried more passengers than Switzerland, and had better punctuality than Austria, and exported car parts to 100 countries. Now, oh my God, I was on the trains. You do not want to go. The trains are horrific. South Africa,
if they run, if they
aren't being burned, and if you aren't killed on them by gangsters, or they aren't burned at the station,
or if the scheduling doesn't happen to overlap with the government scheduling of power outages, in which case, with the few electrical lines that are still in operation,
the train just stops randomly somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah. So South Africa at one point had the deepest vertical shaft in the world. Okay, for an operational shaft, not an experimental shaft. Right now, South Africa was accused of being a police state. These are the last few. It's like the last half dozen or so. So South Africa was supposed to be a police state. That is not true. There was a state of emergency, and I was heavily involved because I was a kid growing up there. This stuff was happening around me. You got caught up in it sometimes without even intending to. Right? You're just walking home from school, and bang, you're in the middle of a riot. Right? So in South Africa, there was 1.4 officers for every 1,000 people, right? At that time in the UK, it was 2.2. Israel, 3.5. New York, 4.3. And Moscow, 10 per 1,000. So if things were so bad, why did we have so few police officers? In South Africa, there were 16,292 white policemen and over 19,000 black policemen, which is interesting, right? Now, South Africa was accused of killing political offenders. 1979 to 1980, there were no deaths in South African prisons. None. In the previous 10 years, 37 died. And in Wales and England, in the same period, 274 deaths in prison. Now, I can also say here that as far as I recall from the stats, In South Africa, at one point in the 80s, they were accused of being crazy about locking up political prisoners. South Africa had, I think, something like 330 political prisoners. The UK had 3,000, 10 times more. But the whiteys in South Africa were the problem.
Now, to be fair, the United Kingdom has always had political prisoners. It still has today. And I honestly don't agree with comparing to the United Kingdom. Let's compare it with more democratic countries. I mean, how many?
At one point, Cuba, right? Cuba, that everyone loves because they were communist, had 600,000 people. 1/5 of their population was in prison. But the whiteys in South Africa were bad for having 300.
Well, of course, because they weren't communistic enough. Then ANC came along and fixed the problem, obviously.
Now it's okay. Yeah, I forget. You're right. Go on.
No, that's the thing. That's the argument. No, they weren't communistic enough, and then the ANC showed up and fixed the problem.
It's okay when you're communist. You can arrest 20% of your population and disappear.
Yeah, just say you're a socialist and you're good people. There you go.
Yeah, they were accused of paying starvation wages. In 1974, the average monthly income of black workers in South Africa was $127. In the US, it was $140, and that's in the richest country in the world. So yeah, I don't know how those poor oppressed blacks were, like myself, were getting paid so well. They were accused that they locked up, there we go, thousands of political prisoners. In 1983, there were 127 such prisoners, and 11 whose movements were limited. A further 32 under house arrest. Oh my God, that's genocidal numbers.
At a population of what, 30 million at the time?
40 million, 35, 40 million.
35 million, yeah, something like that. I'm thinking in 83, so that's 40-something years ago. Yeah, well, it doesn't sound that bad, definitely.
Yeah, so these are just some facts about South Africa. Yeah, but it's not real communism, exactly. Yeah, it wasn't real apartheid. Real apartheid has not been tried. And I know lots of black people that will vote for real apartheid tomorrow if that was available as a possibility, because they are sick.
Even if it gets back to half of the stats from the 1980s apartheid, that would still be a significant improvement over the current status of the ANC. Yes, and it's not just about economics. That's what I'm saying. I mean, I'm yawning about the materialist facts. Because we see this in Europe as well. People didn't chimp out in Europe as a result of 20 years of perpetual recession. I mean, the European Union, especially the western part of the European Union, has been under recession since 2003, uninterruptedly. The European Union today is less than half of the United States, while we were on par with the United States in 2002, right?
Yeah.
Nobody chimped out about that. When did we started chimping out? Illegal immigration and violence. Public safety, as it turns out.
Also the green scam, because lack of availability for power means your economy can't grow.
The green scam. But the green scam is recent. And there still haven't been any violent riot. Well, I guess with the exception of the farmer protest in Brussels, where they threw shit at the European Commission. Now, those fuckers deserved it, so that's okay. But with the exception of that, and that was in what, 2020 or 2021? But still, that's 20 years into perpetual recession. The most violent riots that occurred were as a result of illegal immigration. And that's when we started chimping out and voting for the far right. Illegal immigration and lack of public safety. That's why the so-called far right in Eastern Europe is nowhere near as harsh or as hated as in Western Europe, because, well, here public safety is still a thing.
You know, if things weren't so bad in South Africa, I would have been living in South Africa now. Actually, I've got a few more things I can show. So, for instance, Nelson Mandela's bombs, our peaceful little warrior here, right? He was the co-founder of Umkhonto we Sizwe. He was in charge, one of the people in charge there. Car bomb, killed 19, wounded 217. Car bomb, killed 5, wounded 27. At least 150 landmines planted on farm roads killed 125. Now look, these figures are going to be disputed. Everyone's going to say, well, we don't have exact numbers. Granted, but this should give you an idea. Planting bombs all over the place doesn't leave a victim-free environment. So this guy was responsible for a lot of bombing. The man was a terrorist, right? So yeah, I wonder if he was a communist. What do you think? What do you think, Lucian?
Well, again, this has been established a long time ago. Again, I even provided a mainstream source from the Telegraph I mean, this is really not under dispute. Even the wokies are slowly coming to terms with this fact that, yeah, maybe this wasn't the nicest guy. And again, it's a feature of time passing, right? In 2000 or even 2012, it was still too close to the event, and there was still much more of an emotional reaction. But as time goes on and we move further away from those events, it becomes easier to come to terms with some of these really uncomfortable facts.
Yeah. In 2001, the country had 2.5 million people on social grants or welfare, and 12 million were employed formally. Today, there are 18 million people on welfare and only 14 million people that pay tax. Of a country of nearly 60 million, because we know at least 15 million illegals will let in, right? That's the communist playbook, let in millions of illegals. So, in other words, the tax base is only marginally larger, but the welfare base is now 6 times bigger.
6 times long. Now, technical question: does that 18 million people figure include pensioners or just working age welfare recipients?
Working age people, and I mean, they also remove. Actually, it's more like two and a half times bigger, 3 times. But also, they remove people who stop looking.
Oh yeah, of course. That's a trick that is deployed in Europe as well.
And also, a lot of people work and they don't pay taxes. So there's a lot of that money.
I'm a big fan of those.
Yeah. The problem is that now the government has now started this new process where white businesses are supposed to pay 3% of profit, 3% of revenue into a fund, 100 billion rand fund, to fund black business, because black business is doing so well 30 years after the ANC has come to power because of white people, because of a legacy of apartheid. And of course, they're doing the expropriation without compensation. In other words, we'll take your land and just like it. So, otherwise known as theft.
Yeah. I mean, again, when you said that there are people who don't pay work and don't pay taxes there, well, I'm a big fan of those. I mean, in addition to me believing in an absolute sense that taxation is theft, it's also the fact that in South Africa, the government is quite literally the enemy. So why the hell would you pay taxes to the enemy?
That's also true.
Yeah.
So these are news headlines taken from South Africa. Poverty in South Africa soared in 2015, right? So South Africa is becoming poorer by every metric, right? So levels of poverty have increased. South Africa has the most inequality out of 149 countries. Inequality has increased since apartheid. Actually, you mean since apartheid ended? Oh my God! Under the ANC, the Communism, the legacy of theft, corruption, has the lowest life expectancy in the world. It's not.
I don't think that's true. With the lowest life expectancy in the world, that doesn't sound true. I'm sorry.
Well, because I mean, okay. Well, let's look at this one: rats feeding on blood and waste inside South Africa's hospitals of horror. Here's a photograph taken. So, South Africa's decline is the worst among nations not at war, right? And now notice 14. So during the worst of the political violence, there's a maximum figure of something like 14,000 dead blacks that could killed, I think 600 political killings, whatever. Then with the ANC, these numbers are very low. We can go, so 30,000 dead white farmers in 21 years of democracy. We've gone from nuclear power to coal power. The rand was 2 rand to $1. Here it's 17 to 1. It's probably 18 to 1 today. Rapes per annum, 372. Rapes per annum, about 54,000. 90% blacks employed, 52%. In fact, it's lower now, right? You look at the unemployment amongst the youth, it's over 60%. So these figures, things are just worse under apartheid. There's no metric you can point to where things are better. Everyone go, but black people can now apartheid's bad, and that's the argument. So
Orange man bad. So I was looking for the life expectancy part, and I'm right. It's not the lowest in the world. It is in the very much in the bottom quintile, but not the lowest in the world. There are worse places. And the thing is that the worst places are also somewhere around. So, for instance, closest to the worst in the world is Lesotho. But yeah, it's pretty bad.
I want to mention one thing, if I may, because I see someone. Hold on. This guy. So now, Nuam. your statement here is called bullshit, because so that the Nelson Mandela Foundation themselves, the Nelson Mandela Foundation themselves deny that claim. They squashed reports that the former president received training from Israeli agents in 1962. The media have picked up on a story alleging that in 62 Mandela interacted with an Israeli operative in Ethiopia. The foundation can confirm, the Nelson Mandela Foundation can confirm, it has no evidence found in Nelson Mandela's private archive that he interacted with an Israeli operative during his tour of African countries. Okay.
Well, that one is easy to refute, because there was the first evidence of any Israeli operative in that region is about 10 years later than that interaction allegedly take place. So it could not have happened. To make things worse, the Mandela-influenced ANC government preferred to starve its own people in late 2010s, when I believe it was Johannesburg that ran out of drinkable water. And Israel, and then later on the whole country, yes. And the Israeli government offered for free to offer the technology to desalinate and just solve the problem. Yes, and the official answer was no, because you guys are Jews.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but you guys need to drink water. Well, no, because you guys are Jews. And Bibi Netanyahu was like, well, screw you. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So
but we do know that they were very close to Yasser Arafat and the PLO and the
oh yeah, of course.
So
that is absolutely true. I mean, I know quite a bit about that, because Yasser Arafat used to receive training, well, actually not far away from where I'm videotaping this. So yeah, most of the communist movements around the world were sympathetic, at the very least, to the PLO.
Right. Yeah, I mean, same source. I mean, the charter was written in Moscow, so another communist creation. So yeah, that's my story on apartheid, and it's just that the whole claim about Israel has voting for Arab Muslims, and we know what will happen to Jews in Gaza; they'll get murdered. So this is not the same. I mean, there's definitely the whole. It's a false equivalence.
If we're going to claim that Israel is running an apartheid regime, then I would suppose the first people to complain about it should be the Jews who got forcibly removed from Gaza when Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. I know this is in prehistory, 20 years ago, but the Israeli government quite literally uprooted all of the Jewish people in Gaza when they withdrew from Gaza. They were like, no, we're going to give the Arabs the land entirely for themselves, right? And that means everyone not from there or not ethnically Arab will have to fuck off. And if they don't, we will forcibly remove them, which they did, right? So those Jewish people can complain about apartheid.
No, granted. And then, of course, the Israelis rescued hundreds of thousands of black Jews from Africa.
Oh, yeah, of course. They have their own neighborhood. I stayed in that neighborhood in my last visit to Israel, in Tel Aviv. It's technically called the Ethiopian neighborhood, but in reality, there's multiple other black ethnicities as well who live in Israel. Some of them Jewish, some of them not Jewish, but it's not just Ethiopians. It started with Ethiopians, granted.
Yemeni Jews and so on. So yeah.
So
this is my story on apartheid. There's so much more we can talk about the atrocities during the. I mean, the ANC was very likely at one point to lose the election to the Inkatha Freedom Party under Gatsha Buthelezi. And the Inkatha Freedom Party, the man was very educated. He believed in peace. He wanted a peaceful transition. He wanted a peaceful government. He wanted to integrate. And he had an organization that was 3 times larger than the ANC. So what did the ANC have to do? Well, they decided, you know what we're going to have to do? We're going to have to kill all of these his leaders, his managers, his supporters. So they said, okay, what we're going to do today? We're going to go out and murder the people in charge of the IFP. And that's what they did. They murdered them. They killed, eventually something like 50,000 people died in the whole process. And they managed to destroy his whole management, his whole leadership structure. And Yeah, and they won the election because you just kill your enemies. That's the whole Genghis Khan approach, and that's what the ANC did and does. And Nelson Mandela was not innocent of that.
Of
The
course.
man was guilty of permitting assassination and murder and slaughter, even of innocents.
It's really funny that the Genghis Khan way of doing things, the Mongol way of doing things, did actually survived in Russia, and then got exported via Russia to other places. Whereas in the original lands, which is present day Mongolia and present day Kazakhstan, they've gotten more civilized there, but
True.
right, because these days this discussion is actually discussed precisely in these meme terms, that is to say, we actually graduated from the golden horde, but these fuckers still didn't, referring to Russia in particular, but also to Russian satellite movements such as the ANC, but not just the ANC, the PLO as well, Hamas, and quite a few others, who are basically graduates of the school of Russian way of doing things.
Yeah, shocking. So anything that you learned that was useful here, or any final lesson you think the audience should take away? I mean, with regards to this topic, but I think we presented a lot that people were not familiar with.
Fair enough, but the thing is that I do maintain my point of view. That is, it's good to know the facts, but it's ultimately not particularly useful unless you're discussing with someone of similar level of education. And for intellectual exercises, as in Oxford Debate Society and things like that, the main lesson is the Russian proverb "Все имеет смысл в контексте." Everything makes sense in context. That is to say, for the commenter that said, yeah, the ANC was bad, but the apartheid was not necessarily a solution. Well, yes, but everything makes sense in contexts. And once you know the context, it suddenly makes a little bit more sense, even if you disagree with it, right? But for the wider public, if you're going to convince someone, maybe some of the facts may matter. Like, for instance, the fact that blacks were better educated under apartheid on a per capita basis than they are today. Yeah, maybe that will convince some people. But most of the other materialist facts will not necessarily convince people.
They will come back and they'll call it, there's a name for it, apartheid education, this Bantu education.
Right.
It was really bad. We were given very basic literacy. We were just there to say, yeah, boss, near boss, yes, boss, no boss. They'll come back with their own propaganda talking point. I mean, for every solution.
Right, and okay, fine. Let's grant that. Okay, that's true. Let's grant it for the sake of the argument. Okay, then why are the literacy numbers worse today than they were then? I mean, if that was crap, marginal, subpar education, okay, fine. The ANC-led leadership provides even less than that.
True. Yeah, shouldn't they be educating people? What's with this 25% is a pass result? You do your maths, you get 25% in your exam, you get your certificate. You're now an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get 25% and they don't pass you, well, you're going to burn down the university. You're going to riot. You're going to kill people, burn hundreds of cars, because that's what people do, right?
And the shortage of electricity, that's how it started. The affirmative action replaced competent people with incompetent people, because it started as a crisis of distribution. Then it morphed into a crisis of production. But for several years, actually, South Africa was still producing enough energy, but just couldn't distribute it because all of the engineers who were supposed to upkeep the infrastructure were now DEI hires and had no idea what the hell they were doing. And it doesn't help that the universities routinely have these things of, let's study, black magic as equal to Western science. Let's decolonize engineering and all sorts of that crap, which has been a thing in the West as well, but it produced far worse effect and far faster in a country that is not able to easily attract talent from abroad. Because, if you bork the education in Europe or in North America, it has a negative effect, but ultimately you can still fill in the necessary positions with competent people by just paying bigger wages and attracting them from abroad, from China or from India or from Russia, why not, or Central Asia or whatever. But South Africa, going fastly down economically, cannot afford to do that. And if it doesn't raise its own talent and it cannot import talent from abroad, then the result is decay.
Yeah.
obviously.
You know what's interesting? The whole argument about America needs Indians with an 85 IQ to come in and do all the technical labor and all the
Now, to
intelligent
be
jobs.
fair, they only need the Brahmis, which are higher IQ than that. But
Yeah, but understand the whole. I've worked with just so everyone knows, just because I'm here to pour gasoline on the fire. I worked with a lot of Indians, a lot of lovely Indians. Granted, I had some great friends, but there's a lot of Indians that come in from, I don't know, Bumfluff University, which when you look for it on the internet doesn't exist because
Mhm.
it's a fake certificate they printed at the airport for $5.
Yes.
And these people are not competent. These people are not skilled. Many of them, and besides, okay, maybe they can code in C or Pascal or COBOL or BASIC, whatever the heck you need for the day. But other than that, they add roughly zero to the country's culture.
Yes,
So
but by the same token, I'm actually very glad that this is happening, because the class of people harmed by this are the class of people that deserve to be harmed by this.
probably,
We have to understand that
yeah, but
IT
you know what
workers
else? For
in
every
Silicon Valley, no. The IT workers in Silicon
point,
Valley in particular have been the biggest perpetrators of progressivism and the biggest amplifiers of the most dangerous and harmful ideologies that have been permeating both Europe and North America for the last 20 years. And them being harmed by this policy is a very good thing for the moral progress
yeah,
of
agreed. Like,
society.
but also it harms everyone else, which is sad.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I think we will be
Okay,
better off if the
good
IT
people,
sector has a
talented white
minus
people don't get jobs.
20%.
Talented Asian people, genuine Asians like Japanese
Mm,
or Koreans in America that deserve it, don't get those jobs because it goes to some guy because his skin is brown. Now I
yes.
say this is a brown skinned guy, and then also for every one of these people you bring from Bum Fluffistan, he brings six of his family members who go
Yeah.
on.
No, I'm completely aware of that, but I also don't particularly care, because the primary victims of this are exactly people who deserve it. That's one aspect. And second aspect, I'm hoping that this scandal will eventually convince more Westoids. The distinction between Westoid and Westerner is that not all Westerners are Westoids, and not all Westoids are Westerners, right?
Right.
Westoids are people who hold Western progressive ideas, right? I'm
Okay.
hoping that the Westoid companies will finally learn something that we in Eastern Europe learned really fast after communism fell, which is screw the resumes, screw the diplomas, let's do a test, let's see what your aptitudes are, and
Right.
that's how we make the decision. The western part of of our continent, Europe and North America, have been stuck into this credentialist loop
Yeah.
where everything matters depending on what school you went and when, and all sorts of these superficial nonsense that say nothing about the
If
capacities of
someone
the
told me today
individual.
they came from Harvard, I'd look at them skew. I'd go like, "Yeah, I don't think we got a place for you on this team."
Right. So, the Indians, good for them for exploiting this already flawed system to their benefit, because maybe that would convince the Westoids to simply abandon this way of doing things
Yeah.
and get back to how they used to do things as well back in the 50s. In the 50s, you had something called tests. Let's test. Let's see what exactly you can do, and let's see if you can fit.
100%. I'd agree. We need to
No.
go back to we need. That's why we formed tradition. These were ideas that worked, and when you abandon tradition, the problems come back.
Yeah,
And
the
people like
problems
you,
that the tradition was solving are now suddenly coming back. And if you know that's the problem with tradition, because it's oftentimes the enemy of its own success, right? Because, or victim of its own success, because if enough time goes on with a certain tradition, people effectively forget what the problem was that led to that tradition being formed in the
right?
first place, right?
Yeah,
So
we
there's that.
forget that we forgot, and then we mess up.
No, yeah,
Yeah,
and then we need a generation or two to remind ourselves of what exactly was the problem and why that tradition was formed, and then eventually a new version of the same tradition gets re-implemented, uh, and then we'll say lesson learned, and then 60 or 70 years later we'll make the same mistake, and on like that till the end of time.
yeah, yeah. Villainous. If South Africa was the country it should have been, the country that I remember, the country that I left, I would be living there now. We would be living there, and it would be great. I lived in a great place, lovely
Uh,
environment. Oh, and
until
I
it
would
got
love.
bombed, that is.
Say again, sorry.
Until it got bombed, that is.
Until things went bad. Yeah, let's say things went very bad, and for reasons of safety, I grew up there. I'm comfortable, but when you're with someone who has no idea what is going on when they are just, you can see when they're in an environment and they walk into an environment, they're a tourist, they don't understand the signals, they don't know the signs, and you can see the rest of the people around them just view them as prey. Not good, not good. And this is not something I wanted to take responsibility for, not something I wanted to deal with, to explain to her family what happened to her. Do you understand? It's not a position I wanted to be in. So it was, as much as
Oh,
I...
so someone says there that I'm still down with the class guilt. No, I'm not down with the class guilt, but there is such thing as groups of people, right? And if in a group of people, 98 or 95% are guilty of something, I will say that I will not lose sleep when that whole group gets what it's coming to them,
Yeah.
right? So, IT workers in Silicon Valley donate, 99% of them donate money to the Democrat Party. 97% amplify far left progressive ideologies. 100% of them voted for Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. There's basically no Trump voter.
Joe Obama.
And Obama, of course. So I'm sorry, but when eventually that group with these statistics has its coming and they start losing their jobs and they get personally into economic problems and whatnot, I'm gonna say, well, there's a lesson in fucking around and finding out. Right? So it's not class guilt because it's not. They chose to be part of that group. Right?
Yeah.
It's not something that happened to them. They were sitting there innocently, and then something suddenly happened to them, like it happened with the manufacturing workers who had no say in them being economically displaced. Right? In the case of IT workers, I'm sorry, they did have a say, a long say for decades, and well, sometimes there's big consequences. Ideas have consequences. It's just is what it is.
True. That is a fact. So look, I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I wanted to talk about apartheid, and you need to understand there's no reason for white people to have guilt and to do away with themselves to the benefit of black people, because, honestly, you have a superior culture, you have a history to be proud of, and when you start looking, if you're going to go again, if you're going to flagellate yourself for things that your ancestors did 300 years ago, we can point to the recent past and we can point to serious atrocities committed by black people.
Mm-hmm.
The black people, Nelson Mandela's tribe, enslaved others, right? They were cannibals, right? These people were genocidal maniacs, and they had no idea what toilet paper was as last century, okay? These were primitive people. We're not talking sophisticated savages. No, primitive. Utterly primitive, pooping in a hole in the ground in the 1900s. I don't consider that to be some kind of an achievement.
Now,
right.
Question. Tell me about the Indian families in South Africa, since you brought Indians, like the Gupta family and all the basis for the cult.
I mean, they bought out the government, and they're corrupt as hell.
Oh, of course, yeah, but how? I mean, because they were a force during apartheid as well. I mean, they are the basis for which the colored category was created.
I mean, these people, if they think about it, how did Mahmoud Abbas become a billionaire? How did so many of the ANC become billionaires and multimillionaires, become wealthy? I mean, that's how it works. I mean, how did the Palestinians not have basic public facilities, but their leaders, you developed, 7 or 8 billionaires all of a sudden? But they don't have proper hospitals? I wonder what happened. I mean, it's all a grift. I mean, these people control the levels of industry. These people are behind the scenes making the deals, and they benefited. And obviously, everyone wants to go around, well, it's white capital influence, and white people only... Yeah, sure. Let's not talk about black corruption. We've just become another corrupt black state.
Mm. Right, because it's a very, I suppose, in a more academic setting, it would be more appropriate to discuss the influence of Asians to both the eastern part of Africa and South Africa, not just the Republic, but the whole region. Because due to the trade routes, there has been quite a lot, especially in economics, there has been quite a lot of Asian influence, not just Indian, Indonesian as well, and Indo-Chinese.
People don't realize these cultures bring their culture with them.
Mm-hmm. Of
And
course.
white culture doesn't only succeed well because of necessarily Christian values, but they're more honest. So other cultures, people don't realize that these values are not universal. Other cultures
Hmm.
are often much more dishonest, much more prone to be corrupt. It's part of the culture. It's part of their religious value system. It's part of their whatever causes it.
Hmm.
But you cannot treat every culture as equal. And they might bring programming skills in I don't know, in Pascal or COBOL, whatever you need today, tomorrow. But they also bring a lot of other problems that plague their cultures. And when there's enough of them, it becomes an infection. I mean, yeah. So those are my thoughts. And apartheid was not all bad. Apartheid had a great deal of positives. The government was doing its utmost to literally uplift, to raise up the black population into the middle class. And the ANC destroyed that. The ANC didn't want that. All of these reactionaries didn't want to see an uplifted black population because then they would be white people and they couldn't have that.
Yeah.
And yeah, but if they had, you would have a great country, stay safe and stable, and you'd have a colorblind country. But now we don't have that anymore.
Well,
Not at all.
there is a place like that. I mean, in Brazil, white and black are class distinctions, not racial distinctions. So the like the multi-millionaire black football players in Brazil, they're white from a
Yeah,
class perspective, right? But as someone says here, and if I'm allowed a joke, and Mike Simao says, "Brother Lloyd, I have to argue with you. It's one of the best feelings to go to the woods to relieve your bladder." Well, actually, you try to convince, especially African Americans, to come join you in the woods for any activity, and you will see that they'll be uneasy about it. I have no idea why, but I've noticed that a lot of
please. I hate the term African American. I am African, and I've got Black Americans because they're more
no, no, no,
American.
no, no.
They
I
call me
mean it when I say
Lloyd.
African American because that to distinguish it
I
from Africans from
hate
Africa.
that term. I hate that they're Black Americans because
Okay,
I'm
fine.
African. And then these asswipes, excuse my French, they tell me, but Lloyd, I'm blacker than you, therefore I am more African. And my reply is, fuck you. You haven't seen Africa for 400 years. Go away.
That's true. Although, so anyway, Black Americans seem to be very much afraid of the woods. So
Yeah.
I don't know why is that the case. As for Black Americans in general, I really love those kinds of videos when, especially Black women from the United States, go to an African country and try to LARP there as a local, and they suddenly realize that the locals despise them a lot more than other people,
Yeah.
because well, it turns out that they're not really well perceived, and that is because the culture of blacks in the US has deviated even more, and in ways oftentimes deemed as even
Yeah.
worse than other versions in Africa. So there's that.
Yeah. Yeah. He's saying StreamYard. Yeah. I need to be careful when I say here because I've walked the line a lot of times here. So yeah. But look,
We're,
guys,
thankfully, we're not using StreamYard, so maybe these guys would be more
yeah, I'm
careful.
not using StreamYard. Yeah, I'm using. Yeah, I'm not using StreamYard. There's that. I'm not on StreamYard. I don't. Yeah, I have a different account. Stopped using StreamYard because $45 a month is insanity. Um, yeah. So guys, that's my story, and I'm sticking by it. Um, and yeah, I just think that apartheid. There's a lot more to the story than you were told. Really, the whole anti-apartheid movement was the pro-communist movement. It led to the overthrow of a government that was actually good for the country, that cared about the country, that was uplifting the country. And it's gone backwards. Everything has gone backwards. And apartheid was, sure, people didn't like the fact that it was making honest statements about those black guys. They need to up their game. They need to get on the A game before they can come and play with us. But of course, now we've got to go, no, 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 no. Everybody's fine. Even if they don't use underarm and don't travel for a week, they're just as good as us. No, they just said out loud what people didn't want to hear at the time. But they were just dealing with the problem of how do you integrate a group that is quite literally in the Stone Age, 20,000 years behind the rest of us. And that's not an exaggeration.
Mhm.
Last word from me. That's it. Last word to you. Then we call it a night, Lucian.
Yeah, no, I'm just looking at the comments because a lot of them have some humor in it, like Elon being the most famous African American, which which is true, and of course led to a lot of other conspiracies, like his wealth comes from the exploitation of black people in the mines by his father during the apartheid regime. And I'm like, guys, his father is like 1% of his son's wealth. I mean, come on, that just doesn't work like that. Ramaphosa was a shop steward and unionist. Now he's suddenly one of the richest in Africa. Well, who knew it pays to shill for Russia? By the way, Ramaphosa is a good example of Russian subversion. I've got the chance to.
Because he's a capitalist and a successful businessman, he's going to run the country well like a businessman. Turns out he did not.
Yep, pretty much.
So yeah, guys, I got to call it a night here. So Lucian, any final word before we call it a night? Before we go?
That would be pretty much it. I mean, we've said enough controversial things for a night.
I think we did. Let's hope we can do this again in a few months. All right, guys.
No,
hopefully
we'll try.
And thanks, everyone. Take care. Good night. It's been good.